Tonight we are going to talk about the saddest story Tolkien never finished telling. Not the saddest story in The Lord of the Rings, there are plenty of those, and most of them have endings. Boromir's horn splits and the hero falls. Théoden charges at dawn and dies beneath his horse. Frodo saves the world and then discovers that the world he saved no longer has a place for him. Those stories are devastating. But they are complete. They have beginnings and middles and endings. You can hold them in your mind, you can grieve them, and then set the grief down. The story of the Entwives is not like those stories. The story of the Entwives has no ending. The story of the Entwives is a question that Tolkien asked and then refused to answer. Refused not because he did not know the answer, but because the refusal was the point. The mystery is the message. The not knowing is the grief. Tonight we are going to walk all the way through that mystery. From the beginning, from the creation of the Ents and the Entwives, from the world's morning, when the tree shepherds first awoke, all the way through the separation, the searching, the silence. We are going to examine every clue that Tolkien left, every hint, every letter, every interview, every marginalia in which Tolkien addressed or pointedly did not address the fate of the Entwives. And then we are going to sit with the question, because the question is the story. And the story of two kinds of love that could not share the same forest is the saddest thing Tolkien ever wrote, precisely because it has no resolution. This one is quiet. This one aches. Stay with me. Part 1. In the beginning, before the separation. The Ents were created by Yavanna. This is where the story starts, not with the Ents themselves, but with the being who imagined them into existence. Because the why of the Ents' creation contains the seed of everything that follows. Yavanna Kementri, the queen of the earth, the Vala whose domain is growing things, the divine being whose specific quality of care extends to every plant and every tree and every living thing that roots in the soil and reaches for the sun. Yavanna is the protector of the natural world. And Yavanna had a problem. The problem was all. Her husband. The Vala of craft, the divine maker, the being whose specific quality of intelligence is the intelligence that shapes, that engineers, that takes raw material and converts it into finished product. All created the dwarves, made them in secret, shaped them from stone, gave them the specific quality of maker's intelligence that his own nature embodied. Yavanna saw what all had made and was afraid. The dwarves would cut trees, the dwarves would mine the mountains. The dwarves and the other peoples who would walk in Middle-earth, the elves and the men and the various races whose relationship with the natural world was fundamentally instrumental, the peoples would use the forests, would cut them, would burn them, would treat the growing world as raw material for the making world. Yavanna asked Eru the One, the creator of all things, for protection, for guardians, for beings who would defend the growing things against the peoples who would cut them. And Eru granted the request. The Ents were born, the shepherds of the trees, the beings whose specific purpose was to protect the forests, to stand between the growing world and the peoples who would destroy it. This origin matters enormously for the Entwives story, because the origin establishes the fundamental tension that drives the separation. The Ents were created to protect the wild. The growing world. The forest as it exists without human intervention. The Ents' purpose is custodial. They tend what already grows. They do not shape it. They do not cultivate it. They do not impose their will on it. They watch. They guard. They shepherd. The Entwives wanted something different. Part 2. What the Entwives were. The Entwives are not simply female Ents. The Entwives are a distinct expression of the Ent nature, a different orientation toward the same fundamental reality. And the difference between the Ents and the Entwives is the difference that drives the entire story. The Ents loved the great trees, the old trees, the wild trees, the trees that grow according to their own nature, in the deep forests, untouched by any will except the will of their own growth. The Ents' love for the trees is the love of the guardian for the wild thing, the love that says, I will protect you as you are. I will not change you. I will not shape you. I will let you be what you are, and I will stand beside you while you grow. The Entwives loved the smaller things, the grasses, the grains, the fruit trees, the cultivated plants, the plants that grow in gardens, that produce food, that sustain the peoples who eat them. The Entwives' love was not the guardian's love for the wild thing. The Entwives' love was the gardener's love for the tended thing, the love that says, I will help you grow. I will shape you. I will cultivate you. I will make you into something more than what you would be without my care. The distinction is not a moral distinction. Neither the Ents' love nor the Entwives' love is better or worse. Both are expressions of the same fundamental impulse, the impulse to care for growing things. But the two expressions are different, are incompatible in the specific sense that they require different landscapes to operate in. The Ents need the forest. The wild, deep, untouched forest where the great trees grow according to their own nature, and the guardian's role is to protect them from interference. The Entwives need the garden, the cultivated, tended, shaped space where the smaller plants grow according to the gardener's design, and the gardener's role is to guide and shape and cultivate. The forest and the garden are different places. Not just physically different, philosophically different. The forest is the place where nature is left alone. The garden is the place where nature is guided. The forest is the wild. The garden is the tame. And the beings who love the wild and the beings who love the tame cannot live in the same place, because the same place cannot be both wild and tame simultaneously. This is the seed of the separation. Not a quarrel, not a betrayal, not a dramatic conflict between two opposing wills, a quiet, fundamental, irresolvable difference in orientation, a difference in what kind of love each being brings to the growing world, and what kind of landscape that love requires. Part 3. The separation. The Ents and the Entwives separated. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic break, not in a single moment of decision. The separation was gradual. The Ents drifted toward the deep forests. The Entwives drifted toward the open lands. The drifting was natural as water following gravity, as natural as a plant turning toward the sun. Each kind of being moved toward the landscape that their specific quality of love required. The Ents went west, into Fangorn, into the ancient forests of the Misty Mountains' eastern slopes, into the specific, deep, old-growth wilderness that the Ents' custodial love was designed to protect. The Ents went where the great trees were, where the oaks and the beeches and the ancient things grew tall and slow, and needed the shepherd's protection. The Entwives went east, into the Brown Lands, into the open territory between Mirkwood and Mordor, into the specific, cultivated, garden-quality landscape that the Entwives' gardening love was designed to tend. The Entwives went where the grains and the grasses grew, where the smaller things needed the gardener's attention, where the soil could be worked and the plants could be shaped, and the specific quality of cultivation that the Entwives embodied could be expressed. The separation was not a divorce. Let me be clear about this, because the metaphor that people use the Ents and the Entwives broke up is misleading. the Ents and the Entwives did not stop loving each other. The Ents and the Entwives stopped living in the same place. The love continued. The Ents loved the Entwives. The Entwives loved the Ents. The specific, deep, abiding quality of affection that the tree beings felt for each other did not diminish because of the distance. The Ents thought about the Entwives. The Entwives thought about the Ents. The missing was real. The longing was genuine. But the love could not overcome the difference. The Ents could not live in the garden because the Ents' nature required the forest. The Entwives could not live in the forest because the Entwives' nature required the garden. And the two landscapes, the forest and the garden, the wild and the tame, could not be the same landscape. The separation is the mythological expression of a truth that Tolkien understood with devastating precision. Love is not always enough. Two beings can love each other deeply, genuinely, permanently, and still be unable to share a life. Not because the love is insufficient, because the needs are incompatible. Because the specific quality of what each being requires to be themselves cannot be provided by the same place, the same mode of living, the same landscape. The Ents need the wild, the Entwives need the tame, and the love between them, the genuine, undeniable, never extinguished love, cannot bridge the gap between the wild and the tame. The separation happened before the recorded history of the Lord of the Rings, before the War of the Ring, before the kingdoms of men, before the rings of power. The Ents and the Entwives were already separated when the history that we know began. The separation is the background, the longing is the constant, and the searching, the Ents' endless, fruitless, heartbreaking searching for the Entwives, is the specific narrative expression of the love that survives the separation and that refuses, across thousands of years, to accept the separation as permanent. Part 4. What the Entwives built. The Entwives' gardens were remarkable. The gardens that the Entwives cultivated in the lands east of the Anduin were, by all accounts, among the most beautiful and productive cultivated landscapes in the history of Middle-earth. The Entwives taught men agriculture. This is a detail that most people miss, and it changes the way you understand the relationship between the Entwives and the mortal world. The Entwives were the beings who taught the early men how to cultivate grain, how to tend fruit trees, how to work the soil in the specific, systematic, knowledge-informed way that transforms subsistence gathering into productive farming. The Entwives were the inventors of agriculture, or rather, the Entwives were the transmitters of agricultural knowledge, the beings whose specific quality of understanding of cultivated plants made them the natural teachers of the mortal peoples who needed to learn cultivation in order to survive. This detail connects the Entwives to the foundational activity of human civilization. Without agriculture, there are no cities. Without cities, there are no kingdoms. Without kingdoms, there is no Gondor, no Arna, no Rohan, no Shire. The entire structure of human civilization in Middle-earth, the structure that the Lord of the Rings describes, and that the War of the Ring is fought to preserve, that structure depends on agriculture. And agriculture was the Entwives' gift. The Entwives' gardens were in the Brown Lands. The specific region east of the Anduin, south of Mirkwood, north of the mountains of Mordor, this region was once fertile, once green. Once the specific quality of cultivated tended, Entwife managed landscape that produced the grain and the fruit that sustained the peoples of the East. The gardens were beautiful, not with the wild beauty of the forest, the beauty that the Ents love, the beauty of the untouched, the unmanaged, the thing that grows according to its own will. The gardens were beautiful with the cultivated beauty of the tended landscape the beauty of ordered rows, of managed growth, of the specific quality of aesthetic pleasure that a well-tended garden produces. The two beauties, the wild beauty and the cultivated beauty, are different, and the difference is the separation made visible. The Ents forests are beautiful because they are wild. The Entwives gardens are beautiful because they are tended. And the two beauties, which arise from incompatible principles, cannot coexist in the same space. The Entwives created something in the Brownlands, something specific, something valuable, something that the mortal world depended on. The Entwives were not idle in their separation from the Ents. The Entwives were in fact, the most productive beings in the mythology, in the specific sense that the Entwives' work created the agricultural foundation on which human civilization was built. The Entwives were not waiting for the Ents to come find them. The Entwives were building something. And the thing they built, the cultivated landscape, the agricultural knowledge, the gardens that fed the peoples of the East, was the Entwives' answer to the question of what to do with a life lived apart from the beings you love. Part 5. The Brownlands. The Brownlands are the scar. The evidence, the specific, geographic, visually devastating proof that something terrible happened to the Entwives' gardens. The Brownlands, as the Fellowship sees them during the journey down the Anduin, are a wasteland. Barren, dead, the specific quality of landscape that results when a fertile region is destroyed, not neglected, not abandoned, but destroyed. Actively, deliberately, catastrophically destroyed. The name itself, the Brownlands, tells you what happened to the green. The lands were green. The lands were the Entwives' gardens. The lands produced grain and fruit and the specific quality of cultivated beauty that the Entwives' gardening produced. And now the lands are brown. Dead. Empty. What happened? Sauron happened. The destruction of the Entwives' gardens is attributed to Sauron, to the specific, deliberate, strategically motivated destruction that the Dark Lord inflicted on the lands east of the Anduin during the wars of the Second Age or the early Third Age. Sauron's forces, his armies, his power, his specific quality of destructive will burned the gardens, scorched the earth, destroyed the cultivated landscape that the Entwives had built over centuries of careful The destruction was strategic. Sauron destroyed the gardens not because he hated gardens, though the Dark Lord's relationship with growing things is consistently hostile, but because the gardens were an asset. The gardens produced food. The food sustained the peoples who lived in the region. The peoples who lived in the region were potential enemies or potential subjects. The destruction of the gardens was the destruction of the agricultural infrastructure that made independent life in the region possible. Sauron's destruction of the Entwives' gardens is an act of war, not an act of random malice, a calculated, strategic, militarily motivated act of destruction designed to deny resources to the enemy and to make the landscape unusable for any purpose except the Dark Lord's own. The Brownlands are Sauron's work. The dead landscape is the Dark Lord's signature, the specific, visual, geographically enduring evidence of what happens when the Dark Lord decides that a piece of the world should die. And the Entwives were in those gardens when Sauron came. This is the question. This is the mystery. This is the specific, agonizing, unanswered question that drives the entire Entwives story. What happened to the Entwives when Sauron destroyed their gardens? Part 6. 3 possibilities. There are 3 possibilities, 3 categories of answer to the question of what happened to the Entwives, and each category carries a different emotional weight, a different set of implications, a different quality of grief. Possibility 1. The Entwives are dead. Destroyed when Sauron destroyed their gardens. Burned in the fires that scorched the Brownlands. killed by the same forces that killed their gardens, their grain, their fruit trees, their cultivated beauty, dead and gone, their specific quality of being extinguished from the world, their absence permanent and irreversible. Possibility 2. The Entwives survived, but are lost. Scattered by Sauron's attack, driven from their gardens, dispersed across the lands of Middle-earth in a diaspora that separated them not only from the Ents, but from each other. Alive, but present in the world, but hidden, concealed by distance, by disguise, by the specific quality of diminishment that overwhelmed peoples undergo when they are driven from their homes. Possibility 3. The Entwives survived and are somewhere specific. Present in the world, in a location that the Ents have not searched, in a form that the Ents have not recognized, doing work that the Ents do not know about. Alive, intact, and findable, if only someone knew where to look. Each possibility has textual support. Each possibility has implications. And each possibility produces a different quality of grief, the grief of death, the grief of dispersal, the grief of the missed connection. The grief of death. If the Entwives are dead, the grief is the grief of irreversible loss. The Ents are mourning beings who are gone. The searching is futile, not because the searcher is looking in the wrong place, but because the thing being searched for no longer exists. The grief of death is the cleanest grief, the grief that, however devastating, has the specific quality of finality that allows eventual acceptance. The grief of dispersal is ambiguous. If the Entwives are scattered, the grief is the grief of the possible but unlikely reunion. The Ents are mourning beings who may exist, somewhere, in some form, and the possibility of existence makes the grief more complicated than the grief of death, because the possibility prevents closure. The grief of dispersal is the grief that says, maybe they are out there. Maybe we will find them. And the maybe, the endless, tantalizing, never confirmed, maybe is more painful than the certainty of death, because the maybe keeps the wound open. The grief of the missed connection is the cruelest. If the Entwives are somewhere specific, alive and findable, if the Ents could find them, if only the Ents knew where to look, then the grief is the grief of the preventable separation. The grief that says, we could be together. We should be together. We are apart not because the universe has separated us permanently, but because we have not found each other yet. And the not finding, the specific, agonizing quality of searching for something that exists but that you cannot locate, is the cruelest grief, because it combines the pain of absence with the possibility of presence. Tolkien refused to specify which possibility is true. And the refusal is the point. Part 7. What Tolkien actually said. Tolkien addressed the fate of the Entwives in several letters and interviews, and the pattern of his responses is itself a clue not to the Entwives' fate, but to Tolkien's intention in leaving the fate unresolved. In letter 144, Tolkien writes, I think that in fact the Entwives had disappeared for good, being destroyed with their gardens in the War of the Last Alliance. This seems definitive. The Entwives are dead. Case closed. Except Tolkien immediately undercuts the definitiveness, but I do not know for certain. The author of the mythology does not know for certain what happened to his own characters. The uncertainty is deliberate, is not the uncertainty of a writer who has not yet decided, but the uncertainty of a writer who has decided that the story is better without a decision. In another context, Tolkien said something more revealing. He suggested that the Entwives might have survived, might have crossed the Anduin, might have gone, and here is the detail that changes everything west, into the lands that became the Shire. The suggestion is tantalizing. The Shire is the most fertile region in Western Middle-earth. The Shire produces the finest pipeweed, the finest beer, the finest food. The Shire's agricultural abundance is unmatched by any other region in the Western lands. And the Shire's abundance has never been explained. The hobbits are good farmers, certainly, but are they good enough farmers to explain the Shire's extraordinary productivity? Or is there something else at work, something ancient, something Entwife-derived, something that has been working in the soil for centuries without anyone noticing? The possibility that the Entwives are in the Shire, or rather, that the Entwives' influence is in the Shire's soil, in the Shire's extraordinary fertility, in the specific quality of the Shire's agricultural abundance, is one of the most emotionally complex possibilities in the entire mythology. Because if the Entwives are in the Shire, they are in the one place the Ents would never look. The Ents look in the wild places. The Ents search the forests and the mountains and the remote, untouched landscapes where the Ents themselves feel at home. The Ents would not search the Shire, would not search a cultivated, agricultural, hobbit-inhabited landscape, because the Shire is everything the Ents are not. The Shire is tame. The Shire is cultivated. The Shire is the Ents are looking for the Entwives in the forest. The Entwives, if they are anywhere, are in the garden. And the search fails not because the searcher is not diligent, but because the searcher is looking in the wrong kind of place, is looking in the wild for beings whose nature requires the tame. The irony is devastating. The Ents cannot find the Entwives, because the Ents are looking for the Entwives in the Ents world rather than in the Entwives world. The search fails because the searcher does not understand the sort. The Ents, who love the Entwives, do not understand the Entwives well enough to know where to look for them. This is the separation, extended into the search. The Ents and the Entwives separated because they needed different landscapes. The Ents cannot find the Entwives because the Ents search in the Ents landscape rather than in the Entwives landscape. The same difference that drove the separation prevents the reunion. Part 8. Treebeard's Song. Treebeard sings about the Entwives. The song is one of the most quietly heartbreaking pieces of poetry in the entire Lord of the Rings, and the song tells you everything about the separation that the narrative analysis cannot convey, because the song is not analysis. The song is feeling. The song is a dialogue. The Ent speaks. The Entwife responds. The two voices alternate, each describing the landscape they love, each inviting the other to share it. The Ent describes the forest, the mountain slopes, the great trees, the wild places where the wind moves through the branches. The Entwife describes the garden, the ordered land, the cultivated fields, the tended places where the grain grows in rows and the fruit hangs heavy on the branch. Each voice is beautiful. Each landscape is beautiful, and the two beauties cannot occupy the same space. The song's final verse is the Ent's promise. Together we will take the road that leads into the west, and far away we'll find a land where both our hearts may rest. The promise is a hope, the hope that somewhere, in some undiscovered landscape, there is a place that is both forest and garden simultaneously, a place where the wild and the tame coexist, a place where the Ent's love and the Entwife's love can be expressed in the same soil. The promise is never fulfilled. The land where both hearts may rest is never found. The song ends with a question that Treebeard acknowledges has never been answered. Where the Entwives went, and whether the shared land exists. Treebeard sings this song to Merry and Pippin. The hobbits are sitting in Fangorn Forest, listening to an ancient being describe the loss that has defined his existence for thousands of years. The scene is quiet. No battle, no urgency, just an old being, singing about the beings he loved and lost, to two small people from a faraway land who cannot possibly understand the scale of the grief they are hearing. But the hobbits do understand. Not the scale. The hobbits cannot comprehend the thousands of years, the geological time frame, the specific quality of loss that an immortal being experiences when separation extends across millennia. But the hobbits understand the grief. The hobbits understand what it means to miss someone. The hobbits, who are far from home and missing the Shire, recognize in Treebeard's song the specific quality of longing that is universal, that transcends the differences of species and scale, and applies equally to the ancient tree shepherd and the young hobbit. The scene is the mythology's most precise expression of the theme that grief is not proportional to power. The most powerful beings in the world, the Ents, the tree shepherds, the creatures who can tear apart stone walls with their bare hands, are as helpless in the face of loss as the smallest hobbit. Power does not protect against grief. Strength does not prevent longing. The being who can break a fortress cannot find the being he loves. Part 9. The Ents search. The Ents searched for the Entwives. Searched for centuries. Searched across the entire breadth of Middle-earth, through forests and mountains and plains, and the specific quality of exhaustive, systematic, desperately thorough searching that only beings with millennia of time could undertake. The search failed. The failure of the search is the central mystery of the Entwives story, and the failure is more significant than the mystery itself, because the failure tells you something about the nature of the search that the outcome alone does not convey. The Ents are not stupid. The Ents are not careless. The Ents are ancient, intelligent, deeply knowledgeable beings who understand the natural world better than any other beings in Middle-earth. The Ents know plants. The Ents know landscapes. The Ents know the specific fine-grained quality of ecological detail that should make them the most effective searchers in the world. And the Ents cannot find the Entwives. The failure is not a failure of effort. The failure is a failure of understanding. The Ents search for the Entwives in the places where the Ents would go in the forests, in the wild places, in the specific quality of landscape that the Ents' own nature finds congenial. The Ents do not search in the places where the Entwives would go in the gardens, in the cultivated places, in the specific quality of landscape that the Ents find alien and uncomfortable. The search fails because the searcher searches for the sort in the searcher's world rather than in the sort's world. The Ents look for the Entwives the way the Ents look for anything, by going to the forest and looking among the trees. But the Entwives are not among the trees. The Entwives are among the grains, among the grasses, among the small, cultivated, tended things that the Ents' perception does not naturally attend to. The search fails because of the same difference that caused the separation. The Ents cannot find the Entwives because the Ents cannot see the Entwives' world, cannot perceive the cultivated landscape as a place where an Ent being might live, cannot recognize the garden as a habitat for the beings they love. The failure is a failure of empathy. Not a lack of love. The love is real, is deep, is undiminished by the centuries of searching, but a lack of the specific quality of imaginative empathy that would allow the Ents to see the world through the Entwives' eyes and search in the places where the Entwives' eyes would lead. Treebeard asks the hobbits, "Have you seen Entwives in the Shire?" The question is asked casually, almost as an afterthought. But the question is the most important question Treebeard has ever asked, the question that represents thousands of years of searching, compressed into a single inquiry directed at two small beings from a land that Treebeard has never visited. And the hobbits say no. They have not seen Entwives in the Shire. But the hobbits do not know what an Entwife looks like. The hobbits have never seen an Entwife. The hobbits' no is not the no of certainty, It is the no of ignorance. The hobbits cannot confirm the absence of something they would not recognize if it were present. The question hangs. The question has been hanging for thousands of years. And the question, have you seen the Entwives, is the specific, permanent, never-answered question that defines the Ents' relationship with the world after the separation. Part 10. Sam's cousin Hal. There is a detail in The Lord of the Rings that most readers skim past, and that changes the Entwives story entirely if you pay attention to it. Early in the Fellowship of the Ring, in the chapter A Long-Expected Path, the hobbits are discussing strange happenings in the Shire. Sam Gamgee mentions that his cousin Hal claims to have seen a walking tree, a tree-like figure, taller than an elm, striding through the north of the Shire. A walking tree. In the Shire. The detail is presented as hobbit gossip, the kind of exaggerated tavern tale that hobbits tell each other and that nobody takes seriously. Sam himself is not sure whether to believe his cousin. The detail is buried in a chapter that is primarily concerned with Bilbo's farewell party and the introduction of the ring's significance. But the detail is there, and the detail, in the context of the Entwives story, is explosive. If Hal saw a walking tree in the Shire, what did he see? An Ent? Possibly, but the Ents are in Fangorn, hundreds of miles away, and the Ents have not been seen outside Fangorn in living memory. A Huorn? Possibly, but the Huorns, like the Ents, are associated with the ancient forests, not with the cultivated landscape of the Shire. An Entwife? The possibility is there. Tolkien placed the detail in the text. Tolkien, who was precise about his details, who did not include extraneous information, who crafted every element of the narrative with the specific quality of intentionality that his scholarly temperament demanded. Tolkien placed a report of a walking tree in the Shire in the same text that contains Treebeard's unanswered question about whether the hobbits have seen Entwives in their homeland. The two details, Treebeard's question and Hal's sighting, are separated by hundreds of pages. They are never connected in the text. The narrative never draws the line between the question and the possible answer. The connection is left for the reader to make or not make. The connection, if made, is devastating, because the connection suggests that the answer to Treebeard's question, "Have you seen Entwives in the Shire?" might be yes. Might be yes, and the hobbits did not know it. Might be yes, and the Entwives were there, in the Shire, walking through the North Farthing, visible to the hobbits who did not know what they were seeing. The answer might have been yes. And the hobbits said no, and Treebeard accepted the no. And the search continued. And the Entwives, if they are in the Shire, remained unfound, not because they are hidden, but because nobody recognized them. Part 11. The Shire connection. Let me build the Shire connection more carefully, because the connection is not a single detail. It is a network of details, a web of textual hints that, taken together, suggest something extraordinary. The Shire is the most agriculturally productive region in Western Middle-earth. This is not disputed. The Shire's farms produce the finest food, the finest pipeweed, the finest beer in the Western lands. The productivity is remarkable, more remarkable than the hobbit's farming skill alone can explain. The Shire's soil is extraordinary. Rich, fertile, productive beyond what the geography and climate would predict. The specific quality of the Shire's agricultural abundance, the quality that makes the Shire the breadbasket of the Western lands, is not adequately explained by the hobbit's technique alone. The Entwives were the masters of cultivation. The beings whose specific quality of understanding of cultivated plants made them the supreme gardeners of Middle-earth. The beings who taught men agriculture. The beings whose presence in a landscape would, presumably, enhance the landscape's agricultural productivity to the specific quality of extraordinary abundance that the Shire displays. The connection is circumstantial. There is no text that says the Entwives went to the Shire. There is no passage that confirms the presence of the Entwives in the Hobbit's homeland. But the circumstantial evidence is substantial, the Shire's extraordinary fertility. The walking tree that Hal saw. Treebeard's specific question about the Shire. The Entwives' established pattern of moving toward cultivated agricultural landscapes. The Shuri's position in the western lands west of the Brown Lands, west of the Anduin, in the specific direction that beings fleeing Sauron's destruction of the Eastern Gardens would logically travel. The circumstantial evidence does not prove the connection. The circumstantial evidence suggests the connection, and the suggestion, the tantalizing, never confirmed, never denied suggestion, is the specific quality of narrative ambiguity that Tolkien deployed with devastating effectiveness throughout the mythology. Tolkien leaves the question open, leaves the suggestion hanging, lets the reader sit with the possibility that the Entwives are in the Shire, that the hobbits have been living among the Entwives for centuries, that the agricultural paradise that the hobbits enjoy is the Entwives' garden. The possibility is both comforting and agonizing. Comforting because it suggests that the Entwives survived, that the beings Treebeard loves are alive, are well, are doing what they love in a landscape that suits their nature. Agonizing because it suggests that the Entwives are findable, that the search has failed, not because the sought are gone, but because the searcher is looking in the wrong place. Part 12. Why the Ents cannot see the garden. The Ents' inability to find the Entwives, assuming the Entwives are findable, is not a failure of effort or intelligence. It is a failure of perception. And the failure of perception is the deepest dimension of the Entwives' story. The Ents perceive the world through the forest's eyes. The Ents see the world in terms of the wild, the ancient, the untouched. When the Ents look at a landscape, the Ents see what is wild, in it see the trees, the untended growth, the specific quality of naturalness that the forest embodies. The Ents' perception is calibrated to the forest the way a musician's ear is calibrated to melody. The Ents hear the forest's song and miss the garden song, because the garden song is in a register that the Ents' ears are not tuned to. The Entwives, if they are in the Shire, are in the garden. They are in the cultivated landscape. They are among the fields and the orchards and the hedgerows and the specific, managed, tended quality of the Shire's agricultural landscape. They are not in the forest because they were never in the forest, because the forest is the Ents' place, not the Entwives' place. And the Entwives' nature has always drawn them to the cultivated rather than the wild. The Ents would walk through the Shire and see the fields, would see the grain, would see the orchards and the pipeweed plantations and the carefully managed agricultural landscape that the hobbits maintain. And the Ents would not recognize this landscape as the Entwives' work would not perceive the garden as a place where Entwife beings might live, because the Ents' perception does not include the garden in its category of places where beings like us might be. The perception gap is the separation made permanent. The Ents and the Entwives separated because they loved different landscapes. The Ents cannot find the Entwives because the Ents cannot perceive the Entwives' landscape as a place worth searching. The same difference that drove the separation prevents the reunion not through physical distance, but through perceptual blindness. The blindness is not willful. The Ents do not refuse to see the garden. The Ents cannot see the garden, cannot perceive it as the kind of place that would attract the kind of being that the Entwives are. The inability is built into the Ents' nature. The way color blindness is built into certain eyes, the organ of perception is calibrated to one range of reality, and the things outside that range are invisible. Part 13. The tragedy of immortal loss. The Ents are immortal. Or rather, the Ents are indefinitely long-lived. They do not die of old age, do not weaken with the passage of centuries, do not experience the specific quality of decline that mortality inflicts on mortal beings. The Ents endure. The Ents persist. The Ents go on. This immortality, which sounds like a gift, is a curse in the context of the Entwives' disappearance. Because the immortality means that the grief does not end, the loss does not fade. The specific quality of longing that the Ents feel for the Entwives does not diminish across the centuries the way mortal grief diminishes, does not soften, does not blur, does not acquire the merciful quality of distance that time imposes on mortal sorrow. The Ents grieve forever, not in the dramatic, visible, emotionally expressive way that mortal beings grieve, not with tears and wailing, and the specific quality of acute distress that the immediate experience of loss produces. The Ents grieve in the slow, deep, root-level way that trees grieve, with the specific quality of persistent, low-grade, never-resolved sorrow that becomes part of the being's fundamental character. Treebeard's sadness is not an emotion. Treebeard's sadness is a condition. The specific quality of Treebeard's being the slowness, the patience, the deep, deliberate quality of Treebeard's engagement with the world is shaped by the loss of the Entwives. The loss is not something that happened to Treebeard. The loss is something that Treebeard is. The grief has become part of the being's identity, woven into the grain of Treebeard's existence, the way the grain is woven into the wood of a tree. An immortal being who has lost the beings he loves, and who cannot die, cannot end the grief, cannot escape the loss through the specific release that mortality provides, is a being whose existence is defined by the loss. The Ents' existence, after the Entwives' disappearance, is an existence characterized by permanent, low-grade, inescapable grief. The Ents go on. The grief goes on. The two are inseparable. The immortal grieving is the specific quality that makes the Entwives' story sadder than any mortal love story. A mortal love story has an end, death comes, and the grief, however devastating, is finite. An immortal love story has no end. The grief is infinite. The search is infinite. The hope is infinite, and the infinite hope, which refuses to die because the being who hopes does not die, is the cruelest dimension of the immortal grief. The Ents hope. After thousands of years, after centuries of searching, after the brown lands are scorched and the Entwives are gone, and the world has changed beyond recognition, the Ents hope. Treebeard hopes. The hope is not rational. There is no evidence to support it. No reason to believe that the next century's search will succeed where the previous century's search failed. But the hope persists, because the being persists. And the being who persists cannot stop hoping any more than he can stop breathing. Part 14. The Ents decline. Part 13b. The Entwives as mothers. The Entwives are mothers. Not in the sentimental sense, in the biological and existential sense. The Entwives are the beings without whom the Ents cannot reproduce. The Entwives are the other half of the reproductive equation, the half that makes new life possible, the half whose absence means that no new Ents will be born. The identification of the Entwives as the mothers of the Ent species adds a dimension to the loss that the emotional and ecological readings do not fully capture. The loss is general. The Entwives' absence does not merely deprive the Ents of companionship. The absence deprives the Ents of the future. The absence deprives the world of all the Ents who would have been born If the Entwives were present, all the tree shepherds who would have walked in the forests, all the guardians who would have protected the growing things, all the beings whose existence was dependent on the Entwives' presence and whose non-existence is the Entwives' absence made generational. The unborn Entings are the invisible casualties of the Entwives' disappearance, the beings who were never born, the guardians who never guarded, the shepherds who never shepherded. The loss extends beyond the Entwives themselves, extends into the future, into the generations that would have existed, into the specific quality of potentiality that the Entwives' presence would have realized and that the Entwives' absence permanently forecloses. Every Entwive who is gone is also every Enting who will not be born. The loss multiplies across generations. Each missing Entwive represents not one absent being, but an entire absent lineage. The Entwives' disappearance is not the loss of a generation. It is the loss of all subsequent generations. It is the loss of the future. The loss of the future is the most devastating kind of loss, because the future is the thing that loss denies most absolutely. The past can be remembered. The present can be endured. The future, once lost, cannot be recovered, because the future is the thing that was supposed to happen but did not, and the not happening is irreversible. The Ents fading is the future's absence made visible. The old Ents becoming tree-ish, one by one. Across the centuries, this is the species whose future has been foreclosed, living out the present that the future's absence condemns them to. The Ents are the last. The Ents know they are the last, and the knowing, the specific, permanent, inescapable knowledge that no Entings will come after, is the knowledge that makes the becoming tree-ish not merely a natural process, but a tragedy. Part 13c. The complementarity. The relationship between the Ents and the Entwives is complementary. The word deserves because the complementarity is the deepest structural feature of the relationship, and the feature whose disruption produces the most far-reaching consequences. Complementarity means each needs the other to be complete. The Ents without the Entwives are half-beings, are guardians without gardeners, are the wild without the tame, are the forest without the Entwives without the Ents, are also half-beings, are gardeners without guardians, are the tame without the wild, are the garden without the forest. The complementarity is not about love. The complementarity is about function. The Ents function as guardians. The Entwives function as gardeners. The two functions are complementary, each needs the other to produce the complete cycle of growth, protection, cultivation, and renewal that a healthy ecosystem requires. The forest without the garden has no food production. The garden without the forest has no watershed protection. The guardian without the gardener has no cultivation. The gardener without the guardian has no defense. The two halves need each other not emotionally, though the emotional need is real, but functionally, ecologically, existentially, the separation broke the complementarity. The Ents are guardians without gardeners. The Entwives are gardeners without guardians. Each half functions. The Ents still guard, the Entwives, if they fade, still garden. But each half functions incompletely. Each half produces the specific quality of half result that a complementary system produces when one half is removed. The Ents' incompleteness is visible in the becoming tree-ish. The guardians, without the gardener's complement, are losing the animation that the complement provided. The Ents are becoming the things they guard, are becoming trees, are losing the distinction between the guardian and the guarded, are merging with the forest that they were supposed to stand apart from. The Entwives' incompleteness, if they survive, would be visible in the garden's vulnerability. The gardeners, without the guardian's protection, are exposed to the destruction that the guardians would have prevented. The brown lands are the gardener's incompleteness made visible, The garden, without the guardian, is destroyed by the force that the guardian would have opposed. Each half's tragedy is the absence of the other half. The Ents tragedy is the absence of the Entwives tragedy is the absence of the guardian. And both tragedies, the fading and the destruction, are the consequences of the broken complementarity, the split in the system that was designed to function as a whole. Part 14. The Ents decline. The disappearance of the Entwives has a consequence that extends beyond the emotional, a consequence that is biological, existential, and ultimately fatal for the Ents as a species. There are no more Entings, no young Ents, no new generation. The Ents are not reproducing because there are no Entwives to reproduce with. The Ents are the last of their kind, the final generation, the beings who will not be replaced when they finally fade. The Ents are becoming tree-ish. This is Treebeard's description of the process, the slow, irreversible process by which the Ents lose their animation, their mobility, their specific quality of being active, and become more and more like the trees they shepherd. The Ents are literally becoming trees. The active, mobile, speaking, thinking beings are slowly transforming into the passive, rooted, silent, growing things that they have been tending for millennia. The becoming tree-ish is the Ents' response to grief. Not a conscious response, not a deliberate decision to withdraw from the active world. A natural response. The way that a being who has lost the source of his vitality gradually loses the vitality itself. The Ent's vitality, the specific quality of animation that distinguishes the Ent from the tree, was sustained, in part, by the relationship with the Entwives. The relationship provided the complement to the other half, the gardener to the guardian, the cultivator to the shepherd. Without the complement, the guardian function continues, but the vitality that the complement provided diminishes. The Ents are dying. Not quickly, not in the mortal sense of declining and perishing. Slowly, over centuries, in the specific tree-scale time frame that the Ents' nature determines. The Ents are dying by becoming the things they were created to protect, becoming trees, becoming rooted, becoming the specific quality of passive, growing, non-animated existence that the tree represents. The death by becoming tree-ish is the cruelest possible ending for the Ents. Not death as destruction, not the violent, dramatic end that a battle or a catastrophe would provide. Death as fading. Death as gradual loss of self. The slow, imperceptible, century-by-century process of losing the quality that makes you you and becoming the quality that makes you indistinguishable from the things you tend. The Ents are fading because the Entwives are gone. The two facts are connected not by magic or by curse, but by the specific quality of biological and existential interdependence that the Ents and the Entwives share. The Ents cannot reproduce without the Entwives. The Ents cannot maintain their vitality without the complement that the Entwives provided. The Ents, without the Entwives, are a species in terminal decline, a species whose final generation is slowly, quietly, permanently ceasing to be what it was and becoming something less. Part 15. The gender of loss. The separation of the Ents and the Entwives is gendered, and the gendering is not accidental. Tolkien, who was both a devout Catholic and a man of his time, structured the Ent/Entwife relationship around a specific understanding of the complementarity of masculine and feminine, and the structure reveals something about Tolkien's deepest beliefs about the relationship between the sexes. The Ents coded masculine, love the wild, the forest, the untouched, the unmanaged, the thing that grows according to its own will. The Ents' love is the guardian's love, protective, custodial, hands-off. The Ents do not shape the forest. The Ents let the forest be. The Entwives coded feminine love, the tame, the garden, the cultivated, the managed, the thing that grows according to the gardener's design. The Entwives' love is the gardener's love, active, shaping, hands-on. The Entwives do not let the garden be. The Entwives make the garden into what they want it to be. The gendering maps onto traditional roles, the masculine protector and the feminine nurturer, but the mapping is not simple, and it is not wholly traditional. The Entwives are not passive. The Entwives are the most active, most productive, most civilization-building beings in the mythology. The Entwives teach agriculture. The Entwives create the foundation on which human civilization is built. The Entwives are the makers of the mortal world's sustenance. The Ents are the passive ones. The Ents watch. The Ents guard. The Ents stand and wait and let the forest do its own thing. The Ents' custodial love is a love that refrains from action, that defines itself by what it does not do, rather than by what it does. The gendering inverts the usual expectation, the masculine is passive, and the feminine is active. The Ents stand still. The Entwives make things grow. The protectors protect by not acting. The nurturers nurture by acting. The inversion is significant because it challenges the assumption that the separation is the Entwives' fault, that the Entwives left the Ents, that the Entwives' desire for the garden rather than the forest is the cause of the breach. The inversion suggests that the separation is mutual, that the Ents' unwillingness to engage with the garden is as much a cause of the separation as the Entwives' unwillingness to stay in the forest. The Ents could have gone to the garden. The Ents could have visited the Entwives, could have learned to appreciate the cultivated land, could have expanded their perception to include the tended as well as the wild. The Ents did not. The Ents stayed in the forest. The Ents' loyalty to the forest was as much a choice, as much a cause of the separation as the Entwives' loyalty to the garden. The separation is not one-sided. The separation is the product of two stubborn loyalties, two commitments to different landscapes, two refusals to compromise, two expressions of the same fundamental quality of faithfulness to one's nature that the mythology consistently identifies as both virtue and limitation. Part 16. The Theology of the Entwives. The Entwives story has a theological dimension that most readings miss, and the theological dimension is the deepest layer of the narrative. Yavanna created the Ents to protect the growing things. The Ents' purpose, their divinely assigned, theologically grounded purpose, is to guard the forest. The Ents were created for a specific job, and the specific job is the job of protecting the wild. The Entwives' orientation toward the garden is not part of the Ents' original mandate. The Entwives were not created to cultivate. The Entwives were created like the Ents to protect. But the Entwives' nature developed in a direction that the original mandate did not specify, developed toward cultivation rather than protection, toward the garden rather than the forest. The Entwives' development is, in theological terms, a departure from the original design. Not a fall, not a moral failing, not a corruption of the original purpose. A development, an evolution, an expression of the specific quality of freedom that Aru grants to all created, beings the freedom to become something more than or different from what the Creator originally intended. The Entwives' freedom, their capacity to develop in a direction that the original mandate did not specify, is the source of both their creativity and their loss. The Entwives' gardens are the product of the Entwives' freedom, the product of the specific, self-directed, unmandate development that allowed the Entwives to become gardeners rather than and the Entwives lost the destruction of the gardens, the separation from the Ents, the disappearance into mystery, is also the product of the freedom, because the freedom led the Entwives into the open lands, into the Eastern Territories, into the specific, exposed, unprotected landscape where Sauron's forces found them. The freedom that created the gardens also exposed the garden. The development that made the Entwives creative also made the Entwives vulnerable. The departure from the original mandate, the departure from the forest, from the protection of the wild, placed the Entwives in the path of the destruction that the forest would have shielded them from. The theology does not condemn the Entwives for their freedom. The theology acknowledges the freedom as both gift and cost. The Entwives' gardens are beautiful and valuable and necessary for the survival of mortal civilization. The Entwives' gardens are also exposed and vulnerable and located in the specific geography where the Dark Lord's power is strongest. The gift and the cost are inseparable. The same freedom that produces the gardens exposes the gardeners. The same development that creates civilization's foundation places the creators at civilization's most dangerous frontier. Part 17. The Entwives and the Ring. There is a connection between the Entwives and the Ring that nobody talks about. And the connection is this: the ring represents the perfection of the very impulse that the Entwives embody. The Entwives want to shape the growing world, want to cultivate it, guide it, make it into something that serves a purpose. The Entwives' impulse is the shaping impulse, the desire to take the natural world and convert it into something designed, something intended, something that serves the gardener's vision rather than the plant's own nature. The ring is the perfection of the shaping impulse. The ring gives the bearer the power to shape the world, to impose the bearer's will on reality, to make the world conform to the bearer's design. The ring is the ultimate gardening tool, the instrument that allows the gardener to garden not just plants, but minds, not just landscapes, but civilizations. The connection is not a condemnation of the Entwives. The Entwives' shaping impulse is benign, is directed toward plants, toward grain, toward the specific quality of agricultural cultivation that feeds the mortal world. The ring's shaping impulse is malign, is directed toward domination, toward control, toward the specific quality of power over others that destroys the mortal world. But the impulse is the same. The desire to shape is the desire to shape. The difference is in the scale, in the object, in the specific quality of the thing being shaped. The Entwives shape plants. The ring shapes wills. The shaping is the same activity applied to different materials. The connection illuminates the mythology's deepest anxiety about the making impulse. The impulse that produces gardens also produces rings. The desire to shape that feeds civilizations also destroys them. The creative act, the act of taking the raw and converting it to the designed, is the same act whether it produces grain or produces the instruments of domination. The Entwives are the benign expression of the impulse that the ring is the malign expression of. The gardeners and the Dark Lord share the same fundamental orientation toward the world. The orientation of the shaper. The being who sees the world as material to be converted into something that serves the shaper's vision. The Entwives are destroyed by Sauron. The gardeners are destroyed by the being who represents the perfected version of the gardener's own impulse. The irony is theologically precise. The benign expression of the shaping impulse is destroyed by the malign expression of the same impulse. Part 18. The Dead Marshes and what they might mean. The Dead Marshes, the haunted wetland between the Emyn Muil and the Black Gate, are one of the most disturbing locations in The Lord of the Rings, and the Dead Marshes have a possible connection to the Entwives that the text suggests without confirming. The Dead Marshes are the site of the Battle of Dagorlad, the great battle of the Last Alliance, where the combined forces of elves and men fought Sauron at the end of the Second Age. The marshes have expanded since the battle, swallowing the ancient battlefield, and the bodies of the fallen elves and men and orcs are visible beneath the water, preserved in the specific, haunting quality of undead stasis that makes the dead marshes one of the most visually and emotionally disturbing environments in the mythology. The dead marshes are in the Brown Lands, or rather, the dead marshes border the Brown Lands. They are in the same general region, the same devastated, Sauron-touched territory where the Entwives gardens once grew. The geographic proximity is suggestive. The land where the Entwives gardened is the same land where the battle was fought, the same land where the marshes expanded, the same land where the dead lie beneath the water. The dead marshes are not gardens. But the dead marshes are what happens to a garden when the gardener is removed and the destroyer takes over. The fertile land becomes the flooded waste. The cultivated soil becomes the haunted marsh. The specific quality of care that the Entwives brought to the landscape is replaced by the specific quality of corruption that Sauron's presence inflicts on the land. The dead marshes may contain the Entwives, not alive, not living, not gardening, not doing the work that the Entwives' nature drives them to do, but present. The way the dead warriors are present beneath the water, visible, preserved, undead in the specific quality of haunted stasis that the marshes impose on everything they swallow. This is the darkest possibility, the possibility that the Entwives are not lost but dead, not scattered, but destroyed, and that their remains are in the dead marshes, preserved in the same haunting stasis as the warriors who fell at Dagorlad. The possibility that the Entwives, who loved the growing world, are now part of the dead world, are trapped in the specific quality of corrupt preservation that the marshes represent. The possibility is not confirmed. The text does not say the Entwives are in the dead marshes, but the geographic proximity, the temporal overlap, Harmonn's destruction of the Brown Lands, occurred in the same era as the Battle of Dagorlad, and the specific quality of preserved but dead existence that the marshes display, all of these suggest the possibility. And the possibility is the cruelest of all the possibilities. Because the dead marshes are not far from Fangorn. The dead marshes are in the same general region that an Ent searching for Entwives might travel through. The Ents may have passed through the dead marshes during their search, may have looked into the water, may have seen the faces of the dead and not recognized the Entwives' faces among them. Part 19. What the Hobbits Know and Do Not Know. The Hobbits' relationship with the Entwives question is one of the most psychologically complex relationships in the mythology, because the Hobbits are the characters who are most likely to have encountered the Entwives without knowing it, and who are least equipped to understand what they might have encountered. The Hobbits are gardeners. Sam Gamgee Samwise, the Hobbit whose specific quality of identity is defined by his relationship with growing things, is a gardener. Sam's garden is the emotional anchor of the Lord of the Rings. Sam's desire to return to his garden is the motivation that sustains him through Mordor. Sam's gardening is the specific, concrete, physical expression of the Hobbit quality that the mythology identifies as the most valuable quality in the world. The quality of tending, of caring, of the specific attention to small growing things that makes a garden flourish. Sam is doing the Entwives' work. Sam is cultivating. Sam is tending. Sam is shaping the growing world into something that serves the gardener's vision, the specific, small-scale, hobbit-sized version of the Entwives' large-scale agricultural cultivation. The connection between Sam and the Entwives is never made explicit in the text, but the connection is structurally precise. Sam is the mortal expression of the Entwives' impulse. The Hobbit gardener, working in the Shire's extraordinary soil, producing the Shire's extraordinary abundance, is doing what the Entwives taught the mortals to do, is continuing the work that the Entwives began, and that the Entwives' disappearance left unfinished. Sam's gift from Galadriel is a box of earth from Lurien and a seed of the Mulorn tree. The gift is the elven version of the gardener's toolkit, the seed and the soil, the two things a gardener needs to make a garden. Sam plants the seed in the Shire after the scouring, and the Mulorn grows the golden tree, the elven tree, growing in the Hobbit's garden in the Hobbit's land. The Mulorn in the Shire is the Entwives story in miniature. The foreign seed planted in the Shire's extraordinary soil, growing into something that should not grow there, something that belongs to a different landscape, a different climate, a different mode of existence. The Mulorn grows because the Shire's soil can sustain it, and the soil's capacity to sustain the extraordinary, the capacity that the Entwives may have placed in the soil centuries ago, is the Entwives' silent, unacknowledged contribution to the story's resolution. Sam does not know about the Entwives, does not know that the soil he is planting in may have been prepared by beings he has never met, does not know that the extraordinary fertility of his garden may be the last remaining trace of the Entwives' presence in the world. Sam gardens because Sam is a gardener. And the gardening, the specific Hobbit quality of tending and shaping and caring, is the Entwives' legacy expressed through mortal hands. There is a moment in The Return of the King, after the scouring of the Shire, when Sam plants the Mulorn seed in the party field. He sprinkles the grey dust from Galadriel's box around the seed. He waters it. He waits. And in the spring the Mulorn grows faster than any tree has ever grown in the Shire, grows golden and beautiful and impossible. A tree from an elvish realm thriving in a hobbit garden. The Mulorn grows because the soil accepts it. The Shire's soil, the soil that may carry the Entwives' ancient cultivation, welcomes the foreign seed and nurtures it into something extraordinary. The soil does not care that the Mulorn is elvish. The soil does not discriminate between hobbit plants and elvish trees. The soil's fertility, the deep, embedded, Entwife-derived fertility that makes the Shire's agriculture extraordinary, responds to the seed with the same quality of nurturing care that the Entwives would have provided if the Entwives were there. Sam is doing the Entwives' work. Sam, kneeling in the Shire's soil, planting a seed, watching the growing Sam, is the Entwives' continuity. The Hobbit gardener, inheriting the Entwives' practice without knowing the Entwives' name, is the specific, mortal, small-scale expression of the Entwives' enormous, ancient, world-sustaining impulse. The Entwives taught men to farm. The knowledge passed from Entwife to human across the millennia. And the knowledge, arriving in Sam's hands, produces the most beautiful garden in the Shire, the garden that heals the scouring's damage, the garden that restores the Hobbit land to its former beauty, the garden that says, the Entwives' work is not finished. The Entwives' work continues. The Entwives' legacy grows. Part 20. What Galadriel knows. Galadriel is the being in The Lord of the Rings who is most likely to know what happened to the Entwives, and Galadriel never says. Galadriel is thousands of years old. Galadriel was alive when the Entwives were still in their gardens. Galadriel was alive when Sauron destroyed the Brownlands. Galadriel, whose ring Nenya gives her power over preservation and growth, who maintains Lothlorien as the most beautiful cultivated landscape in Middle-earth. Galadriel would understand the Entwives, would understand the gardener's impulse, would understand the cultivator's love. Galadriel's mirror shows things that are, things that were, and things that may yet be. The mirror could, presumably, show the Entwives, could show where they are, what happened to them, whether they survived. Galadriel's capabilities include the specific quality of far-seeing that could resolve the mystery. Galadriel does not resolve the mystery. does not tell Treebeard where the Entwives are, does not use the mirror's power to answer the question that has haunted the Ents for centuries. Galadriel's silence on the Entwives is conspicuous is the silence of a being who may know but who does not tell. Why? Several possibilities. Galadriel may not know. The mirror shows many things but does not show everything, and the Entwives' fate may be beyond even Galadriel's perception. Or Galadriel may know and choose not to tell. If the Entwives are dead, telling Treebeard would destroy the hope that sustains the Ents, the hope that the Entwives might yet be found, that the search might yet succeed, that the separation might yet be healed. The hope is painful, but the hope is also what keeps the Ents from becoming entirely tree-ish. The hope is the vitality's last source. Remove the hope, confirm the death, and the Ents becoming tree-ish accelerates. The confirmation of death is the death of hope, and the death of hope is the death of the Ents. Or Galadriel may know, and the knowledge may be too complex to share. If the Entwives are scattered, if some are dead and some are alive, and some are in the Shire and some are in the marshes, and the truth is not a single answer but a complicated, partial, unsatisfying collection of answers, then sharing the knowledge would not resolve the grief, would complicate it, would replace the clean uncertainty of not knowing with the messy, partial certainty of knowing some but not all. Galadriel's silence is the narrative's silence. The being who could answer the question does not answer the question, because the question unanswered is more important than any answer. Part 21. The Ent Draught and what it remembers. The Ent Draught's the liquid that Treebeard gives Merry and Pippin, the water from the mountain springs that makes the hobbits grow taller. The Ent Draughts are a detail that connects to the Entwives story in a way that most readers do not notice. The Ent Draughts are prepared by the Ents. The specific process, the selection of the water, the addition of the specific Entish quality that transforms ordinary water into the growth-promoting liquid, is an Entish craft. A craft that the Ents possess, but cultivation, the preparation of specific substances from natural ingredients, the transformation of raw material into something that serves a designed purpose, is the Entwives' mode of engagement with the world, not the Ents. The Ents' mode is custodial. The Ents guard. The Ents do not process. The Ents do not transform raw material into designed product. The Ent Draughts are the Ents doing the Entwives' work. The Ents are taking a natural substance and transforming it into something designed growth-promoting drink. The activity is Entwife activity, performed by Ents. The Guardians are gardening. The detail suggests that the Ents learned from the Entwives, that the Ents, before the separation, absorbed some of the Entwives' knowledge, some of the Entwives' specific quality of understanding of how to transform natural substances into designed products. The Ent Draughts are the Ents' inheritance from the Entwives, the specific, practical, cultivation-related knowledge that the Ents acquired during the time when the Ents and the Entwives lived together. The inheritance is poignant. The Ents are doing something that the Entwives taught them, are using knowledge that the Entwives shared, are practicing a craft that reminds them every time they prepare the draught, every time they select the water, every time they add the specific Entish quality that transforms the water that the Entwives existed, that the Entwives knew things, that the Entwives' knowledge persists in the Ents' practice, even though the Entwives themselves are gone. The Ent Drought is the Entwives' ghost. Not a literal ghost, not a supernatural presence. A practical ghost. A trace. The specific, material, physically present evidence that the Entwives' knowledge survives in the Ents' practice. The way a parent's recipes survive in the child's cooking present. Practical, emotionally charged. and impossible to prepare without thinking of the person who taught you how. Part 22. The Rohirric Connection. The Rohirrim, the riders of Rohan, have a specific, largely unexamined connection to the Entwives story, and the connection adds another dimension to the mystery. The Rohirrim inhabit Calenardon, the grassland of the Riddermark, the vast, open, horse-sustaining plain that stretches from the White Mountains to the Entwash. The grassland is fertile. The grassland sustains the horse culture. The grassland produces the grazing that the Rohirric civilization depends on. The grassland may be the Entwives' work. The fertility of the Riddermark, the specific quality of extraordinary productivity that the grassland displays, may be, like the Shire's fertility, the result of the Entwives' influence. The Entwives, whose gardens once extended across the eastern lands, may have influenced the soil of the western lands as well, may have prepared the ground, may have enhanced the fertility, may have laid the foundation for the agricultural and pastoral productivity that the later peoples of the region depend on. The Rohirrim's name for Fangorn Entward acknowledges the Ents. The Rohirrim know about the Ents. The Rohirrim fear the forest and the beings who inhabit it. But the Rohirrim do not know about the Entwives. The Rohirrim do not have a tradition of the Entwives, do not sing about them, do not remember them, do not acknowledge the possibility that the land they inhabit may have been prepared by the beings whose counterparts live in the forest on their border. The Rohirrim ride across the Entwives' legacy without knowing it. The horses graze on the grass that the Entwives may have cultivated. The riders charge across the plain that the Entwives may have prepared. The civilization that the Rohirrim built, the horse culture, the cavalry kingdom, the civilization of speed and open sky, is built on a landscape that may owe its specific quality of fertility to beings that the Rohirrim have never heard of. The irony is characteristic of the Entwives' story. The beings who benefited most from the Entwives' work are the beings who know least about the Entwives' existence. The Shire hobbits eat the food that the Entwives' soil produces. The Rohirric horses graze on the grass that the Entwives' cultivation sustained. And neither the hobbits nor the Rohirrim know that the Entwives existed, let alone that the Entwives' work is the foundation of their way of life. Part 22b. What the Entwives looked like. We do not know what the Entwives looked like. But we have clues, and the clues suggest something that most people do not expect. The Ents look like trees. Treebeard resembles a tree, with bark like skin, branch like limbs, and the specific quality of arboreal form that makes him look like a beech or an oak that has been animated. The Ents take on the qualities of the trees. They tend the correspondence between the shepherd, and the thing he shepherds is the visual expression of the Ents' custodial love. The Entwives, by analogy, would look like the plants they tended. Not trees. The Entwives did not tend trees. The Entwives tended grains, grasses, fruit trees, garden plants. An Entwife might look like a shrub, a hedge, a fruit tree, a thing that grows in gardens rather than in forests, shorter, leafier, more horizontal than the tall, vertical, tree-like Ents. This matters because it explains why nobody recognizes the Entwives. If an Entwife looks like a garden plant rather than a forest tree, then an Entwife standing in a garden would be invisible. The Entwife would look like part of the garden. The same quality of resemblance that makes the Ents look like trees would make the Entwives look like hedges, or fruit trees, or the specific quality of large, old, mysteriously vital garden plant that gardeners sometimes encounter. The Entwives could be in every garden in the Shire, standing in the hedgerows, growing in the orchards. Visible, physically present, and invisible, because nobody knows what an Entwife looks like, and what an Entwife looks like is indistinguishable from what a garden plant looks like. The Ents search for tree-like beings. The Entwives are garden-like beings. The search fails because the search criteria do not match the sought being's appearance. The Ents are looking for walking trees. The Entwives are walking gardens. Part 22c. The Entwives and the seasons. The Entwives' relationship with the seasons would be different from the Ents, and the difference is another dimension of the separation that most readings miss. The Ents are permanent, their appearance does not change with the seasons. The Ents are the same in winter as in summer. The Ents' relationship with time is the relationship of the ancient, unchanging thing that persists through the seasonal cycle without being affected by it. The Entwives would be seasonal. The plants the Entwives love are seasonal. They grow in spring. They fruit in summer. They harvest in autumn. They die back in winter. If the Entwives' physical form mirrors the plants they tend, then the Entwives would change with the seasons: green in summer, golden in autumn, bare in winter, budding in spring. The seasonal change would make the Entwives hardest to find. A being that changes with the seasons, that looks like a growing plant in summer and a bare stem in winter, is a being that is seasonally invisible. The Ents, who are unchanging, search with unchanging eyes. The Entwives look different in every season. The Ent who searches for the Entwife in winter is searching for a different-looking being than the Ent who searches in summer. And the Ent who does not change does not know that the Entwife changes. The seasonal dimension extends the perception gap from space to time. The Ents are doubly blind to the Entwives' landscape and blind to the Entwives' rhythm. Part 22d. What the Entwives taught men. The Entwives' teaching of agriculture deserves more attention, because the teaching is the Entwives' greatest lasting contribution, and its specifics reveal their character. The Entwives taught men to plant, not abstractly specifically. Which crops grow in which soils? Which seeds produce which plants? Which methods enhance fertility and which deplete it? The specific, practical, crop-by-crop knowledge that transforms subsistence foraging into productive farming. The teaching was hands-on. The Entwives demonstrated, showed the early men how to prepare the soil, how to plant the seed, how to tend the seedling, how to harvest the grain. The teaching was mentor to apprentice knowledge transmission that produces competence rather than mere understanding. The Entwives cared about the men they taught. Teaching requires care, requires investment, requires attention to the learner that goes beyond the teacher's interest in the subject. The Entwives did not need to teach men agriculture. They could have kept their knowledge private. They chose to give. The choosing reveals the Entwives' character. The Entwives are givers. The Entwives' fundamental orientation toward the world is the orientation of the being who shares knowledge, who transmits skill, who invests in the learner's capability because the investment serves the world's flourishing. The Entwives are the mythology's greatest teachers. Not the elves teach craft, but to specialists. Not the wizards council leaders. The Entwives teach the most fundamental skill, feeding yourself from the earth, and they teach it to everyone. The most democratic educators in Middle-earth are the beings nobody remembers. Part 23. What Sauron destroyed. The destruction of the Entwives' gardens was not simply an act of military aggression. It was an act of cultural annihilation. And the scale of what was lost needs to be understood, because the scale determines the depth of the grief. The Entwives' gardens were the repository of thousands of years of agricultural knowledge. The gardens were not simply fields, they were the physical expression of the Entwives' accumulated understanding of how cultivated plants grow, how soil works, how the specific quality of tending that the gardener provides transforms the raw landscape into the productive landscape. The knowledge was embodied in the gardens. Not written in books, the Entwives did not write. Not preserved in institutions, the Entwives did not build institutions. The knowledge was in the soil, in the specific, tended, carefully maintained quality of the cultivated landscape that the Entwives had developed across millennia. When Sauron burned the gardens, he burned the knowledge. The soil that the Entwives had cultivated was scorched. The specific quality of tended fertility, the accumulated result of centuries of careful cultivation, was destroyed. The knowledge died with the landscape, because the knowledge was the landscape. The destruction is permanent. The Brownlands have not recovered. Thousands of years after the destruction, the Brownlands are still brown, still barren, still dead, still bearing the specific quality of destroyed fertility that Sauron's forces inflicted. The soil that the Entwives cultivated has not regenerated. The specific quality of tended fertility that the Entwives maintained has not returned. The permanence of the destruction tells you something about the specific quality of what the Entwives provided. The fertility was not natural. The fertility was maintained. The Entwives' gardens were not a natural landscape enhanced by cultivation. They were a maintained landscape, a landscape whose fertility depended on the continuous, active, hands-on quality of tending that the Entwives provided. Remove the Entwives, and the fertility dies. Not gradually, not through slow decline, not through the natural process of neglect that allows cultivated landscapes to return to their wild state. The fertility dies because the fertility was artificial, was the product of the Entwives' specific, active, continuous maintenance, and without the maintenance, the fertility cannot sustain itself. The Brownlands are the proof. The lands that were green under the Entwives' care are brown without it. The fertility that the Entwives maintained was not embedded in the soil, it was embedded in the Entwives' practice. The practice was the fertility. Remove the practice, and the fertility goes with it. This is the specific, material dimension of what Sauron destroyed, not just the Entwives, but the practice. Not just the gardeners, but the gardening. Not just the beings, but the knowledge that the beings embodied, and that cannot be reproduced without the beings who possessed it. Part 24. The Hobbits and the Inherited Garden. The Shire, if the Entwives influenced it, is the exception. The one place where the Entwives' fertility was successfully embedded in the soil, rather than merely maintained by the practice. The distinction matters. The Brownlands' fertility was maintained by the Entwives' continuous presence. When the Entwives left or were destroyed, the fertility collapsed. The Shire's fertility, if it derives from the Entwives, is embedded, is permanent, is self-sustaining, is the specific quality of soil-level fertility that does not require the gardener's continuous presence to persist. The difference between maintained fertility and embedded fertility is the difference between renting and owning. The Brownlands rented their fertility from the Entwives. The fertility was present as long as the Entwives were present, and it departed when the Entwives departed. The Shire, if the connection is real, owns its fertility. The fertility was given to the soil, was embedded in the earth, was made permanent by the specific quality of Entwife work that transforms temporary cultivation into permanent enhancement. The Shire's hobbits inherited the embedded fertility. Inherited it the way you inherit a house without knowing who built it, without knowing the builder's name, without understanding the specific craft that went into the construction. The hobbits farm the Entwives' soil and produce the Entwives' abundance, and do not know that the abundance is a gift from beings they have never met. The inheritance is the Entwives' most lasting contribution to the world. more lasting than their agricultural teaching, because the teaching can be forgotten, can be distorted, can be lost through the generations. But the soil endures. The fertility endures. The specific quality of enhanced productivity that the Entwives embedded in the Shire's earth endures across centuries, sustaining the hobbits who do not know the source of their good fortune. Sam Gamgee is the Entwives' heir. Not in any legal or biological sense, Sam does not descend from the Entwives, does not carry their blood or their identity. But Sam is the heir to the Entwives' practice. Sam gardens. Sam tends. Sam shapes the growing world with the specific quality of attention and care that the Entwives embodied. Sam, working in the Entwives' soil, is continuing the Entwives' work, is maintaining the embedded fertility, is keeping the garden alive, is doing what the Entwives would have done if the Entwives were still there. The heir does not know the ancestor. The gardener does not know the garden's maker. The hobbit does not know the Entwife. And the not knowing the specific, permanent, unbridgeable gap between the practitioner and the being who made the practice possible is the Entwives' story reduced to its essence. The gift persists. The giver is gone. Part 25. The parallels Arwen and Aragorn. The Entwives story is the mythology's primary love story, but it resonates with and illuminates the other love stories that the mythology contains. Arwen and Aragorn. The elf and the man. The immortal and the mortal. The love story that requires one partner to give up immortality, to sacrifice the specific quality of endless existence that defines her nature in order to be with the partner whose nature is mortal. The parallel with the Entwives story is this. In both cases, love requires a sacrifice of nature. Arwen sacrifices immortality to be with Aragorn. The Entwives would have needed to sacrifice their garden nature to be with the Ents, would have needed to return to the forest, to abandon the cultivation that defined them, to become something other than what they are in order to share the Ents' life. The difference is that Arwen makes the sacrifice, and the Entwives do not. Arwen chooses Aragorn over immortality. The Entwives do not choose the Ents over the garden. The Entwives' refusal to sacrifice their nature, their insistence on being who they are, on doing what they do, on living in the landscape that their nature requires, is the cause of the separation. The comparison is not a moral judgment. The narrative does not say that the Entwives should have sacrificed their nature the way Arwen sacrificed hers. The narrative presents both choices, the sacrifice and the refusal, as understandable, as humanly or NA motivated, as products of the specific quality of each being's relationship with their own nature. But the contrast is illuminating. Arwen's sacrifice produces a union that is beautiful and tragic, and that ends in grief when Aragorn dies, and Arwen is left alone, mortal, to die in the fading beauty of the emptied Lothlorien. The Entwives' refusal produces a separation that is also beautiful and tragic, and that produces a different kind of grief, the grief of the never reunited, the grief of the always searching, the grief of the being who loves and cannot reach the beloved. Both choices produce grief. The sacrifice produces the grief of ending the union that must end because one partner is mortal. The refusal produces the grief of never beginning the union that never forms, because neither partner will change. The Entwives' grief is sadder than Arwen's grief. Arwen has the union. Arwen has the decades with Aragorn, the children, the specific quality of shared life that the sacrifice made possible. The Entwives have nothing. The Entwives have the garden. The Ents have the forest. And neither has the other. Part 26. The parallels Fëanor and his jewels. The Entwives story also resonates with the Silmarillion's central tragedy, Fëanor and the Silmarils. Fëanor creates the Silmarils, the most beautiful objects ever made, the jewels that capture the light of the two trees, the treasures that Fëanor loves more than anything in the world. The love for the jewels becomes possessive. The possessive love becomes destructive. The destructive love produces the oath, and the oath produces the wars, and the wars produce the specific, cascading catastrophe that defines the First Age. The Entwives love their gardens the way Fëanor loves his jewels. The love is for a made thing, a cultivated thing. A thing that exists because the lover creates. The love is possessive, not maliciously possessive, but possessive in the specific sense that the lover cannot separate from the loved thing, cannot leave the gardens any more than Fëanor can leave the Silmarils. The difference is moral. Fëanor's love for the Silmarils is corrupted by possessiveness, becomes the destructive, oath-driven, war-producing force that destroys the First Ages. The Entwives' love for the gardens is not corrupted, remains benign, remains productive, remains the specific quality of creative love that feeds civilizations rather than destroying them. But the structural parallel is precise. The being who loves the made thing more than the relationship is the being who loses the relationship. Fëanor loses everything: his family, his people, his life, because he cannot let go of the jewels. The Entwives lose the Ents because they cannot let go of the gardens. The made thing, in both cases, is the obstacle to the relationship. The creation is the barrier to the connection. The Entwives are the benign Fëanor, the gardeners who love their work too much to leave it, even for the beings they love. The creators who cannot separate from their creation, even when the creation costs them the relationship that sustains them. Part 27. What the Ents could have done. Let me spend a moment on the Ents' responsibility, because the Entwives' story is usually told as a story about the Entwives leaving, and the Ents' role in the separation deserves equal attention. The Ents could have visited the Entwives' gardens, could have left Fangorn, crossed the Anduin, travelled to the Brownlands, and spent time in the Entwives' world. Could have learned to appreciate the cultivated landscape, could have expanded their perception to include the garden as well as the forest. The Ents did not. The Ents stayed in Fangorn. The Ents' loyalty to the forest was absolute. The Ents would not leave the trees, would not abandon the guardianship that their nature demanded, would not sacrifice the specific quality of custodial devotion that defined their relationship with the wild. The Ents' refusal to visit the garden is as much a cause of the separation as the Entwives' refusal to stay in the forest. The separation is bilateral. Both partners contributed. Both partners chose their landscape over their relationship. Both partners' faithfulness to their own nature was the instrument of the separation. But the Ents' responsibility is less visible in the narrative, because the narrative tells the story from the Ents' perspective. Treebeard is the one who speaks. Treebeard is the one who sings the song. Treebeard is the one who tells the hobbits about the separation. And Treebeard, naturally, tells the story from the Ents' point of view, from the point of view of the beings who stayed, who waited, who searched. The Entwives' point of view is absent. The Entwives do not speak in The Lord of the Rings. The Entwives do not tell their side of the story. The Entwives' perspective, the perspective of the beings who left, who gardened, who built the agricultural foundation of mortal civilization, is unvoiced. The absence of the Entwives' voice is itself a dimension of the tragedy. The Entwives are lost not only from the Ents' world, but from the narrative. The Entwives are written out of the story, are present only as the objects of the Ents' longing, never as subjects with their own perspective, their own voice, their own account of why they left and what they built, and whether they miss the Ents the way the Ents miss them. The silence of the Entwives is the story's deepest sadness. Not the separation itself. Separation is painful but understandable. The silence. The complete, permanent, unbreakable absence of the Entwives' voice from the narrative that claims to tell their story. Part 28. The ecological reading. There is a way to read the Entwives' story that treats it not as a love story, but as an ecological parable. And the ecological reading is powerful enough to deserve specific attention. The Ents represent the wilderness, the natural world as it exists without human intervention. The deep forest, the old growth, the ecosystem that has been developing for millions of years without management, without cultivation, without the specific quality of human shaping that agriculture represents. The Entwives represent agriculture, the cultivated world. The specific, human-directed, intentionally managed landscape that produces food, that sustains civilizations, that converts the wild into the useful. The separation of the Ents and the Entwives is the separation of the wild from the cultivated, the specific, historical, ecologically significant process by which human civilization draws a line between the forest and the field, between the untouched and the managed, between the wild that is preserved and the wild that is converted. The separation is real. In the real world, in the world that Tolkien inhabited, and that we inhabit, the wilderness and the agriculture are separating. The forests are shrinking. The fields are expanding. The specific quality of wild that exists without human management is being replaced by the specific quality of managed that exists for human use. The Entwives' disappearance is the ecological catastrophe. The cultivated landscape pushed too far, too fast, into territory that is controlled by hostile forces, lowly environmental degradation, or industrial exploitation, or the specific quality of extractive economy that destroys the land it exploits, is destroyed. The gardens die. The soil dies. The brown lands are the ecological wasteland that agriculture leaves behind when the agriculture is driven by exploitation rather than by care. The Ents' grief is the wilderness's grief. The grief of the forest that has lost its complement, that has lost the cultivated landscape that should exist alongside it, that should be the garden to its forest, the tame to its wild. The wilderness without the agriculture is incomplete. The forest without the garden is lonely. The ecological reading does not replace the love story reading. The two readings coexist, are in fact the same reading at different scales. The personal grief of the Ents is the ecological grief of the wilderness. The loss of the Entwives is the loss of sustainable agriculture. The search for the Entwives is the search for the way of cultivating the earth that does not destroy it. Part 29. What Tolkien meant by I do not know. When Tolkien said I do not know about the Entwives' fate, he was making a specific artistic choice. Not a dodge, not the response of a writer who has not yet decided. A choice. A deliberate, intentional, artistically motivated decision to leave the question unanswered. The choice is motivated by the specific quality of the Entwives' story. The story is about not knowing. The story is about the anguish of uncertainty, about the specific quality of grief that comes from not knowing whether the lost thing is dead or alive, findable or gone, present or absent. If Tolkien answered the question, if he said the Entwives are dead, or the Entwives are in the Shire, the story would change. The uncertainty would be replaced by certainty. The grief of not knowing would be replaced by the grief of knowing. And the grief of knowing, however painful, is a different quality of grief from the grief of not knowing. The grief of knowing has resolution. The grief of not knowing does not. The grief of knowing allows for acceptance. The grief of not knowing allows only for endurance. The grief of knowing is finite. The grief of not knowing is infinite. Tolkien chose the infinite grief, chose the unresolved mystery, chose to leave the Entwives' fate unknown, because the not knowing is the story, is the specific, emotional, artistically precise experience that the Entwives' story is designed to produce. The choice is generous. Tolkien is giving the reader the same experience that the Ents have, the experience of not knowing. The reader who finishes The Lord of the Rings does not know what happened to the Entwives, and the not knowing is the reader's participation in the Ents' grief. The reader grieves with the Ents not for the Entwives' death, not for the Entwives' survival, but for the not knowing. The shared not knowing is the bond between the reader and the character. The reader and the Ent are united in their uncertainty, and the uncertainty is the emotional experience that the story is designed to produce. Part 30. The Isengard Connection. Part 29b. The Entwives and Yavanna. Let me return to the beginning, because the beginning contains a dimension that the rest of the story illuminates. Yavanna asked Eru for guardians. Yavanna, whose domain is the growing world, who cares for every plant and every tree, who loves the natural world with the specific quality of divine attention that sustains the world's fertility, Yavanna wanted protectors for her growing things. And Eru granted the request. The Ents were born. But the Ents did not protect everything. The Ents protected the forest. The Ents did not protect the garden. The Ents, who were created to guard the growing world, guarded only half of the growing world, guarded the wild half, the forest half, and left the cultivated half unguarded. The Entwives' gardens were unprotected because the Ents did not consider the gardens part of their mandate. The guardians guarded what they loved and did not guard what they did not love. The divine mandate, the protection of the growing world, was interpreted by the Ents as the protection of the wild growing world, and the cultivated growing world was left to fend for itself. Yavanna's wish was only half fulfilled. The growing world was only half protected. The forest was guarded, the garden was not. And the garden, unguarded, unprotected, exposed to the forces that would destroy it, was destroyed. If Yavanna could speak about the Entwives, what would she say? The divine being who asked for guardians, who received guardians, who watched the guardians protect the forest and ignore the garden, what would Yavanna say about the outcome? She would say, I asked for guardians of the growing world. Not guardians of the forest alone. The growing world includes the garden. The growing world includes the cultivated, the tended, the shaped. The guardians were supposed to protect all of it, not half. All. The failure is not the Ents' fault alone. The failure is structural, is built into the relationship between the mandate and the beings who received it. The Ents' nature drew them to the forest. The Ents' nature blinded them to the garden. The mandate said protect the growing world, and the Ents heard protect the forest, because the forest was the part of the growing world that the Ents' nature attended to. The partial fulfillment of the divine mandate is the theological tragedy of the Entwives' story. The divine wish was for complete protection. The created beings provided partial protection, and the partial protection, the protection of the forest but not the garden, left the garden exposed to the destruction that the mandate was supposed to prevent. Part 29c. The Fellowship on the Anduin. When the Fellowship travels down the Anduin, when the 9 companions paddle their boats south through the river that runs between the Misty Mountains and Mirkwood, they pass through the region where the Entwives' gardens once stood. The Fellowship passes the Brownlands, the barren, dead, scorched landscape that was once the most productive agricultural territory in Middle-earth slides past the boats on the eastern bank. The companions see the desolation. Aragorn, who knows the history, may understand what the desolation represents. The hobbits, who do not know the history, see only a wasteland. The passage through the Brownlands is the Fellowship's encounter with the Entwives' absence. The Fellowship is literally passing through the space where the Entwives lived, is floating on the river that the Entwives used to irrigate their gardens, is looking at the soil that the Entwives used to tend, is present in the landscape that the Entwives made beautiful and that Sauron made desolate. The Fellowship does not comment on the Entwives. The passage through the Brownlands is narrated as landscape description, as the visual backdrop to the journey, not as a site of specific, historical, emotionally charged significance. The narrative does not pause to say, this is where the Entwives gardened. This is where Sauron destroyed what the Entwives built. This is the place that Treebeard grieves for. The silence is characteristic of the Entwives' story. The Entwives' absence is present in the landscape, but absent from the narrative's attention. The Fellowship passes through the Entwives' world without noticing the Entwives' world. The companions are focused on the quest on the ring, on Mordor, on the specific, immediately present concerns that dominate the narrative's attention. The Entwives' story, the ancient, slow, quiet story that is embedded in the landscape rather than in the action, is invisible to the narrative's gaze. The passage through the Brownlands is a moment of unrecognized grief. The companions are passing through a site of devastation that nobody mourns, a loss that nobody remembers, an absence that nobody notices. The Entwives' absence is the absence that is absent even from the narrative of absence. Part 29d. The Lothlorien Parallel. Lothlorien is the Entwives' closest surviving relative in the mythology, and the parallel between the two is structurally precise. Lothlorien is a cultivated landscape, not wild, not the untouched, unmanaged forest that Fangorn represents. Lothlorien is managed, maintained, sustained by Galadriel's ring Nenya, which preserves the specific quality of beauty and vitality that the golden wood displays. Lothlorien is, in the precise sense, a garden, a landscape that has been shaped by a caring intelligence into something more beautiful and more vital than the natural landscape would produce on its own. The Entwives' gardens were the same kind of landscape, cultivated, tended, shaped by a caring intelligence into something that exceeds the natural baseline. The Entwives' gardens were the mortal world's Lothlorien, the cultivated beauty that a caring being produces when the being's specific quality of attention is applied to a receptive landscape. The parallel extends. Lothlorien depends on Galadriel. When Galadriel leaves, when the ring-bearer destroys the One Ring, and the three rings lose their power, Lothlorien will fade. The cultivated beauty that Galadriel's ring sustains will diminish. The garden will decline, because the gardener is departing. The Entwives' gardens depended on when the Entwives left or were destroyed, the gardens died. The cultivated beauty that the Entwives' care sustained collapsed. The gardens became the Brownlands because the gardeners were gone. The parallel is the mythology's most precise statement about the relationship between the gardener and the garden. The garden cannot survive without the cultivated beauty is not self-sustaining. The beauty requires the continuous, active, hands-on quality of care that the gardener provides. Remove the gardener, and the garden dies. Lothlorien will die when Galadriel leaves. The Brownlands died when the Entwives left. The two deaths are the same death, the death of the cultivated beauty that cannot sustain itself without the being whose care created it. The parallel connects the Entwives to Galadriel, connects the ancient, lost gardeners to the living, present gardener. The connection suggests that Galadriel would understand the Entwives more deeply than any other being in Middle-earth would understand the specific quality of loss that the Ents experience, because Galadriel knows what it means to maintain a garden and to know that the garden will not survive the gardener's departure. Part 30. The Isengard Connection. The Entwives story connects to Isengard in a way that most tellings miss, and the connection adds a dimension of irony to both stories. The Ents' assault on Isengard, the destruction of Saruman's fortress, the flooding of the pits, the breaking of the industrial operation, is the Ents' most dramatic action in the entire mythology. The Ents, who have been passive for centuries, who have been slowly becoming tree-ish, who have been declining into the specific quality of listless immobility that the Entwives' absence produces, those Ents finally act. Finally move. Finally bring the ancient accumulated power of the forest against the industrial violation of the natural world. The Ents act because the trees have been cut. The Ents act because Saruman's forces have been stripping Fangorn for timber. The Ents act because the forest, the specific, beloved, Guardians Charge forest that the Ents have been protecting for millennia, is under direct attack. The Ents do not act for the Entwives. The Ents do not march on Isengard to avenge the destruction of the Entwives' gardens. The Ents do not connect Saruman's industrial violation with Sauron's earlier destruction of the Brown Lands. The Ents act for the forest, for the trees, for the specific, immediate, currently happening violation of the wild landscape that the Ents' nature drives them to protect. The irony is this: the Ents, who could not save the Entwives' gardens, can save their own forest. The Ents, who failed to protect the cultivated landscape, succeed in protecting the wild landscape. The Guardians guard the wild. The Guardians could not guard the garden. The failure to protect the garden was not a failure of power. The Ents have the power to destroy Isengard, and Isengard is a far more formidable target than the undefended gardens of the Brown Lands. The failure was a failure of attention. The Ents were not paying attention to the gardens, were not watching the cultivated landscape, were not extending their custodial care to the Entwives' domain. The Ents protected the forest because the forest was their responsibility. The Ents did not protect the gardens because the gardens were not their responsibility, were the Entwives' responsibility, were in the Entwives' domain, were in the specific, cultivated, tended landscape that the Ents' perception did not include in their category of things I am responsible for. The irony is the separation made operational. The same division that separated the Ents from the Entwives, the division between the wild and the tame, between the forest and the garden, is the division that allowed the gardens to be destroyed. The Ents did not protect the gardens because the gardens were not in the Ents' domain, and the gardens, unprotected, were destroyed. If the Ents and the Entwives had stayed together, if the division between the wild and the tame had not separated them, the Ents' power could have protected the gardens the way it later protected the forest. The gardens would have had the guardians. The gardeners would have had the protectors. The combination, the guardian and the gardener, the Ent and the Entwife, working together in the same landscape would have produced a landscape that was both cultivated and protected, both productive and defended. The separation cost the Entwives their protection. The separation left the gardens undefended. And the undefended gardens were destroyed by the same quality of industrial evil that the Ents later destroy at Isengard, but too late. Too late for the gardens. Too late for the Entwives. Part 31. The song that nobody sings back. Treebeard's song about the Entwives is a dialogue, two voices alternating, the Ent and the Entwife responding to each other across the distance that separates them. But when Treebeard sings the song, he sings both parts. The Ent's voice and the Entwife's voice both come from Treebeard. The Entwife does not sing back. The one-sided singing is the separation made acoustic. The dialogue that should be a dialogue that was designed to be a dialogue that was written with two voices because the story requires two voices has become a monologue. The Ent sings both parts because the Entwife is not there to sing her part. The dialogue has collapsed into a single voice, and the single voice, trying to sing both parts, is the sound of loneliness performing the memory of conversation. Treebeard knows both parts of the song. This tells you that Treebeard learned the song when both voices were present when the Entwife was there, singing her response, completing the dialogue. Treebeard remembers the Entwife's words, remembers the Entwife's melody, remembers the specific quality of the Entwife's voice, the precise shape of the Entwife's response to each of the Ents' invitation. The memory is intact. The Entwife is gone. The memory of the Entwife's voice, perfect, precise, never fading across the millennia, is present. The Entwife is absent. The memory and the absence coexist, and the coexistence is the specific quality of immortal grief. You remember perfectly. The remembered being is gone perfectly. The perfection of the memory and the perfection of the absence are equally absolute. When Treebeard sings the Entwife's part, he is not imagining what the Entwife would say. He is remembering what the Entwife said. The distinction matters because imagination allows for evolution, allows the imagined voice to change, to say new things, to respond to new situations. Memory does not allow for evolution. Memory repeats. Memory replays the same words, the same melody, the same response across thousands of years. The Entwife's voice in Treebeard's song is frozen, preserved in memory the way the dead warriors are preserved in the dead marshes present, visible, unchanging, and utterly unreachable. The voice is there. The being who produced the voice is not, and the gap between the voice and the being, the gap between what is remembered and what is real, is the gap that Treebeard cannot cross. Part 32. The biological clock. The Ents are going extinct. Not through violence, not through the dramatic, catastrophic, battle-driven destruction that other species in the mythology experience. Through the quiet, relentless, biologically inevitable process of attrition that a species undergoes when it cannot reproduce. There are no Entings. The young Ents, the saplings, the new growth, the next generation that should be replacing the current generation do not exist. The Ents are the last generation of their species. When the last Ent becomes tree-ish, the species is extinct. The extinction is the Entwife's absence made biological. The Entwife's absence is not merely an emotional loss, not merely the grief of the separated lover. The absence is an existential threat. The absence means that the Ents cannot continue, cannot produce the next generation, cannot sustain the species beyond the current generation's life. The Ents' extinction is the slowest extinction in the mythology, not the dramatic, sudden extinction of a species wiped out in a battle or a catastrophe. The slow, generational, century-by-century extinction of a species that is simply running out of individuals. The Ents are not killed. The Ents fade. The Ents become tree-ish, one by one, across the centuries, and as each Ent, the species shrinks, and the shrinking is irreversible because there are no Entings to fill the gaps. The extinction connects the Entwives story to the broader theme of decline that runs through the Lord of the Rings. The elves are leaving Middle-earth. The dwarves are dwindling. The Ents are fading. The Third Age is an age of endings, an age in which the great, ancient, magnificent peoples of the world are diminishing, are withdrawing, are ceasing to be what they were. The Ents' ending is the quietest of these endings. The elves leave in ships dramatically, visibly, in a departure that is witnessed and mourned. The dwarves dwindle in their halls less visibly, but still noted, still acknowledged by the narrative. The Ents fade in the forest. Nobody mourns. The tree shepherds become trees, and the becoming is so gradual, so quiet, so thoroughly integrated into the natural landscape that the extinction of a species, the end of a kind of being, happens without comment. The uncommented extinction is the saddest dimension of the Entwives story's biological consequence. The Ents will go extinct. Nobody will. The forest will be the same, the trees will still grow, the landscape will still be green, the specific quality of natural beauty that Fangorn displays will still be present. But the shepherds will be gone. The guardians will be gone. The specific, irreplaceable quality of being that tends trees will be absent from the world, and the world will not notice the absence. Part 33. The Entwives and the Fourth Age. What happens to the Entwives question after the War of the Ring? The ring is destroyed. Sauron falls. The Third Age ends, and the Fourth Age begins. The world changes, the elves depart. The men ascend. The specific quality of magical ancient mythological existence that defined the Third Age gives way to the ordinary, mortal, human-dominated existence that the Fourth Age represents. The Entwives question persists. The Fourth Age does not answer it. The destruction of Sauron does not reveal the Entwives' fate. The reshaping of the world does not resolve the mystery. King Elisar Aragorn is told about the Ents' search, is made aware of the Entwives' disappearance. Aragorn, who commands the resources of the reunited kingdom, who has rangers and scouts and the specific quality of organized search capability that a kingdom provides, Aragorn could theoretically organize a systematic search for the Entwives, could send riders into the Brownlands, the marshes, the Western Territories, could use the Palantir to search, could bring the full weight of the kingdom's resources to bear on the question. There is no record of Aragorn doing this, no record of a systematic search, no record of the kingdom's resources being deployed to resolve the mystery. The absence of the record is suggestive either the search was conducted and found nothing, or the search was not conducted because the question was not considered important enough to justify the resources. The second possibility is more likely and more revealing. The Entwives' disappearance, in the context of the Fourth Age's priorities, is not a strategic concern. The reunited kingdom has wars to fight, territories to govern, alliances to maintain. The question of what happened to a group of tree beings who disappeared thousands of years ago is not a priority. The question is filed under mysteries of the ancient world rather than urgent matters of state. The filing is the Entwives' final indignity. The beings whose agricultural knowledge created the foundation of human civilization, the beings whose gardening taught men how to farm, whose cultivation prepared the soil that sustains the kingdoms, those beings' disappearance is not important enough to warrant a systematic search by the civilization they helped create. The Fourth Age inherits the Entwives' gifts, but does not search for the Entwives. The kingdoms eat the food that grows in the soil the Entwives prepared. The farmers use the techniques the Entwives taught. The civilization thrives on the foundation the Entwives laid. And the civilization does not look for the beings who laid the foundation. The ingratitude is structural, not. The Fourth Age's peoples do not know about the Entwives' contribution. The connection between the Entwives' gardens and the current civilization's prosperity is not part of the historical record. The Entwives' contribution is invisible, is present in the soil, but absent from the memory, is embedded in the landscape, but erased from the narrative. Part 34. The Entwives. And the Entwives story does something to the reader that no other story in The Lord of the Rings does. It makes the reader a participant in the search. Every reader who finishes The Lord of the Rings carries the Entwives question with them. Where are the Entwives? Are they alive? Are they dead? Are they in the Shire? Are they somewhere else entirely? In a place that neither the Ents nor the reader has considered? The question persists. The question outlasts the reading. The question is present in the reader's mind long after the book is closed, long after the other questions have been answered, long after the other mysteries have been resolved. The persistence is Tolkien's design. Tolkien designed the Entwives story to persist, to resist closure, to refuse resolution, to remain open in the reader's mind as a permanent, never-answered question. The story is designed to be unfinished. The incompleteness is not a flaw, it is the feature. The story achieves its effect precisely because it does not end. The reader becomes Treebeard. The reader, like Treebeard, knows the question but not the answer. The reader, like Treebeard, hopes that the Entwives are alive, hopes that the mystery will be resolved, hopes that somewhere in the mythology's vast, unexplored territory there is an answer waiting to be found. And the reader, like Treebeard, knows that the hope may be futile, knows that the answer may be they are dead, or they are gone, or there is no answer. The shared not knowing is the story's deepest connection. The reader and the Ent are united in their uncertainty. The reader's grief, the quiet, persistent, never-resolved sadness that the Entwives story produces, is the Ent's grief, scaled down to human dimensions but structurally identical. The reader misses the Entwives. The reader wants to find them. The reader cannot. Part 35. What the Entwives would think of Middle-earth now. If the Entwives survived, if they are somewhere in Middle-earth, alive, aware, what would they think of the world that has developed since their disappearance? They would see that their work persists. The agricultural knowledge they transmitted to men has been maintained and expanded. The cultivation techniques they developed have been adapted and refined. The specific quality of gardeners' care that they embodied has been expressed through mortal hands across hundreds of generations. They would see that their gardens are gone. The brown lands are still brown. The specific landscape that the Entwives cultivated, the landscape that was their home, their work, their expression of their nature, is destroyed. Permanently destroyed. The gardens will not return because the gardeners will not return because the gardeners have been destroyed or scattered or lost. They would see that the Ents are fading, would see that the beings they loved, the guardians, the tree shepherds, the other halves of the complementary pair, are slowly becoming tree-ish, are slowly losing the animation that distinguished them from the trees they tend. Would see that the Ents' decline is, in part, the Entwives' absence made visible, that the Ents need the Entwives, that the Ents cannot sustain themselves without the complement that the Entwives provided. They would see the Shire, would see the fertile, productive, hobbit-tended landscape that may that possibly, arguably, suggestively bear the mark of their influence, would see the hobbits farming with the specific quality of care that the Entwives recognize as their own, would see Sam's garden and Sam's love for the garden and the specific quality of attentive cultivation that Sam brings to his work. They would see Sam, and they would recognize him. Not as an Entwife. Sam is not an Entwife. Sam is a hobbit, but as a kindred spirit. As a being whose nature mirrors the Entwives' nature, a being who loves the garden, who tends the growing things, who shapes the natural world with the specific quality of care that the Entwives embody. And they would know that they are not forgotten. Not remembered. The Entwives are not remembered in the Shire, not known in Rohan, not part of the historical narrative that the peoples of Middle-earth maintain. But not forgotten in the deeper sense, not forgotten in the soil, not forgotten in the practice, not forgotten in the specific quality of care for growing things that persists in the mortal world, because the Entwives planted it. The Entwives' legacy is not in the memory. The Entwives' legacy is in the soil. Part 36. The last conversation. Let me imagine the last conversation between an Ent and an Entwife. Not the last conversation that actually happened, the last conversation that might happen. If the search succeeded, if the Ent found the Entwife, if the separated beings met again after thousands of years of separation. The Ent would say, "I have been looking for you." The Entwife would say, "I know." The Ent would say, "Come back to the forest. The trees miss you." The Entwife would say, "The trees do not miss me. You miss me. The trees are fine without me. The trees have always been fine without me. The trees are your charge, not mine." The Ent would say, "The forest is empty without you." The Entwife would say, "The garden is empty without you." But I stayed in the garden. I did not come to the forest to fill your emptiness. Why should you expect me to now? The Ent would say, "Because I have been searching for thousands of years." The Entwife would say, "You have been searching in the wrong places for thousands of years. You searched in the mountains. You searched in the valleys. You searched in the wild places, the untouched places, the places that are like you. You never searched in the gardens. You never searched in the fields. You never searched in the places that are like me." The Ent would say, "I did not think you would be in a garden." The Entwife would say, "That is the problem." The conversation would not end happily. The conversation would not end with reunion. The conversation would end with the specific, devastating realization that the Ent has known all along. The separation is not about distance. The separation is about perception. The Ent cannot see the Entwife's world. The Ent's eyes are calibrated to the forest, and the garden is invisible. The last conversation, if it happened, would not heal the separation. The last conversation would confirm the separation, would confirm that the difference between the Ent and the Entwife is not a difference that distance or searching can resolve, but a difference in how each being sees the world. Part 37. Why this story matters. The Entwives' story matters because the Entwives' story is everyone's story. Every person who has loved someone and lost them to the distance that different needs create every person who has watched a relationship end, not because the love died, but because the lives diverged. Every person who has searched for someone in the wrong places because the searcher could not imagine the sort's world every one of these people is living. The Entwives' story. The Entwives' story is not a fantasy. The Entwives' story is the most realistic story in The Lord of the Rings. Not realistic in the sense of plausible walking trees and talking forests are not plausible. Realistic in the sense of emotionally true. The emotions that the Entwives' story produces: the grief of the separated lover, the futility of the misguided search, the persistence of hope in the face of evidence. Those emotions are the most universally recognizable emotions in the entire mythology. Every reader knows the Ents' grief. Every reader has experienced the specific quality of missing someone who is not dead, but who is unreachable. Every reader has searched, has looked for the lost thing in the places where the searcher would go, not in the places where the lost thing would go. Every reader has known the specific, devastating moment when the searcher realizes that the search has failed, not because the lost thing is gone, but because the searcher was looking in the wrong place. The Entwives' story is the mythology's most universal story, because the Entwives' story is the story of the gap between two ways of seeing the world. The gap that separates the forest from the garden. The gap that separates the guardian from the gardener. The gap that separates the being who loves the wild from the being who loves the tame. The gap is universal. The gap is present in every relationship between two beings whose natures drive them toward different landscapes. The gap is the distance between every couple who loves each other and cannot share a life. The gap is the space between every parent and child who love each other and cannot understand each other. The gap is the permanent, irreducible, heartbreaking distance between two beings who are made of the same material but oriented toward different horizons. Part 38. The saddest detail. The saddest detail in the Entwives story is not the separation, not the destruction of the gardens, not the Ents becoming tree-ish, not the extinction of the species. The saddest detail is this: the Entwives may have tried to come back. There is a suggestion in the text's faint, ambiguous, never confirmed that the Entwives may have tried to return to the Ents, may have left their gardens, crossed the Anduin, travelled west toward Fangorn, may have made the journey that the Ents wanted them to make, may have overcome the difference, may have sacrificed the garden for the forest, may have tried to bridge the gap, and failed, because the landscape had changed, because the war had transformed the territory between the Brownlands and Fangorn, because the specific quality of distance and danger that separated the gardens from the forest had increased during the years of separation, making the return journey more difficult than the departure journey. The Entwives may have tried to come home, and the home may have been unreachable. The beings who were lost may not have been lost by choice, but by circumstance, driven from their gardens by Sauron's destruction, attempting to return to the Ents, and failing because the world between the gardens and the forest had become impassable. The saddest detail is the possibility that the Entwives wanted what the Ents wanted, that both sides of the separation wanted reunion, that both sides tried to bridge the gap, and that the gap was unbridgeable. Not because of the difference between the beings, but because of the devastation that the external world inflicted on the landscape between them. The world destroyed the bridge. Not the Entwives. The world, the wars, the destruction, the specific quality of the Third Age's cascading catastrophes destroyed the possibility of reunion between two peoples who wanted to be reunited. The saddest detail is, they tried, and the world said no. Part 39. The Entwives and Tom Bombadil. There is a speculation among Tolkien scholars that connects the Entwives to Tom Bombadil's domain, and the speculation, while unprovable, is emotionally compelling enough to deserve attention. Tom Bombadil lives in the Old Forest, the fragment of ancient forest east of the Shire, the small, isolated patch of old-growth woodland that is a remnant of the vast forest that once covered the region. Goldberry, Tom's companion, is the river daughter, a being associated with water and growth and the specific quality of natural vitality that makes Tom's domain the most alive, most verdant, most irrepressibly growing landscape in the Western lands. Goldberry is not an Entwife. Let me be clear about this. There is no textual support for the identification of Goldberry as an Ent. Goldberry is a different kind of being, with a different origin and a different nature. But Goldberry's domain, the specific quality of cultivation and growth that characterizes Tom Bombadil's territory, has the Entwives' fingerprints on it. The Old Forest grows. The Old Forest is vigorous, aggressive, almost hostile in its vitality. The specific quality of the Old Forest's growth, the aggressive, boundary-pushing, actively expanding quality of the trees and the plants, is a quality that suggests enhancement. Something has made this forest more vital than it should be. Something has pushed the growth beyond the natural baseline. The Entwives could be that something. The Entwives. If they passed through the Old Forest on their way west, if the Entwives travelled through the region between the Anduin and the Shire, passing through the ancient forests that once covered the land, the Entwives could have enhanced the soil. could have left the specific quality of embedded fertility that their presence creates, could have turned the old forest from an ordinary forest into the extraordinarily vital, aggressively growing landscape that the hobbits encounter. The speculation is unprovable. But the speculation does what the best Tolkien speculation always does. It draws connections between apparently unrelated elements of the mythology and reveals hidden coherence in the world's design. The Shire, the Brown Lands, 3 landscapes, 3 states of the Entwives' influence, vigorous growth, the Old Forest, embedded fertility, the Shire, complete destruction, the Brown Lamb. 3 points on a line that traces the Entwives' possible journey from the destroyed gardens in the east, through the enhanced forest in the middle, to the fertile fields in the west. The line is speculative. The line is not drawn in the text. But the line, if it exists, tells a story of its own. The story of the Entwives' westward journey, leaving traces in the landscape as they travelled, enhancing every soil they passed through, embedding their quality of care in every landscape they touched. The Entwives' journey, if it happened, was a journey of giving. Every landscape the Entwives passed through was improved by the passing. Every soil the Entwives touched was made more fertile. The Entwives did not simply travel, they gardened as they went. They could not help it. The gardening was their nature. The cultivation was involuntary as breathing, as involuntary as the specific quality of growth promotion that the Entwives' presence produced in every living thing around them. Part 40. What the Ents would say to us. If Treebeard could speak to us, to the audience, to the people who live in the world that the mythology imagines, what would he say about the Entwives? He would say, I miss them. Not eloquently. Not with the philosophical complexity that the analytical mind brings to the subject. Simply, directly, with the specific, unhashable, unbridgeable quality of personal grief that no analysis can reduce to its components. I miss them. The Entwives. My Entwives. The beings who loved the garden while I loved the forest. The beings who taught the mortals how to farm. The beings whose voices I can still hear in the song I sing alone. He would say, do not make our mistake. Do not let the difference drive the separation. Do not assume that because you love different landscapes, you cannot share a life. The difference is real. The difference is important. But the difference does not have to be the end. He would say, we should have visited. We should have gone to the gardens. Should have left the forest, crossed the river, stood in the cultivated landscape and tried to see what the Entwives saw. We should have looked through their eyes, should have tried to understand their love the way they tried to understand ours. He would say, we did not. And now they are gone, and the not visiting is the regret that does not fade. The regret that is older than any kingdom, deeper than any forest, more permanent than any stone. He would say, have you seen them? The Entwives? In your land? In your gardens, in the specific, cultivated, tended landscapes where mortal beings grow their food and shape their soil? Have you seen them? And we would say, we do not know what an Entwife looks like. We do not know how to recognize the beings whose presence we have never learned to see. And Treebeard would nod slowly, the way Ents nod, with the specific quality of ancient patience that has learned to accept the answer no across thousands of years of asking. And the question would remain. Part 41. The Agricultural Revolution. Let me connect the Entwives to the real world for a moment, because the connection is the reason the story resonates so deeply. The agricultural revolution, the real, historical, human transition from hunter-gathering to farming, is one of the most significant events in human history. The transition changed everything: social structure, population density, technology, art, religion, warfare. The transition created civilization. The transition made us who we are. The Entwives, in Tolkien's mythology, are the beings who enabled this transition. The Entwives taught men to farm. The Entwives provided the knowledge, the specific, practical, crop-by-crop understanding of how to cultivate the earth that made the agricultural revolution possible. The loss of the Entwives is, in mythological terms, the loss of sustainable agriculture. The Entwives' gardening was not extractive, was not the kind of farming that depletes the soil, that mines the fertility, that leaves the land barren after a few generations of intensive use. The Entwives' gardening was regenerative, was the kind of farming that maintains the soil, that builds fertility, that sustains the landscape's productivity across millennia. The brown lands are what happens when regenerative agriculture is lost. The soil, which was maintained by the Entwives' continuous care, collapses without that care. The fertility, which was sustained by the Entwives' specific quality of attention, disappears when the attention is removed. The productive landscape becomes the barren landscape, the brown lands, the wasteland. The specific quality of destroyed fertility that modern agriculture, in the real world, is producing across millions of acres of farmland. Tolkien saw this. Tolkien, who grew up in the English countryside and watched the countryside be transformed by industrial agriculture, understood the specific quality of what happens when the gardener's care is replaced by the factory's efficiency. The Entwives' gardens, tended with care, produced beauty and abundance. The modern fields, managed with efficiency, produce abundance without beauty, and the abundance, produced without care, is depleting the soil that sustains it. The Entwives' disappearance is the loss of the kind of agriculture that cares, the loss of the farming that loves the soil, the loss of the specific attention-driven, relationship-based quality of cultivation that treats the earth as a partner rather than as a resource. The modern world has lost its Entwives. The modern world farms without the gardener's love. The modern world produces food without the specific quality of care that sustains the soil across generations. And the modern world's farmland is becoming slowly, imperceptibly, but measurably the brown lands. Part 42. The forest without the garden. The Ents without the Entwives are the forest without the garden. The wild without the tame. The guardian without the gardener. And the forest without the garden is incomplete. The incompleteness is the ecological dimension of the Entwives' absence. The natural world, the wild, untouched, unmanaged landscape that the Ents represent is not complete without the cultivated world. The forest needs the garden. The wild needs the tame. The guardian needs the gardener. The need is not sentimental. The need is ecological. The forest and the garden are complementary ecosystems. The forest provides the deep root structure that stabilizes the watershed, and the garden provides the food production that sustains the human population that the forest cannot feed. The two ecosystems need each other. The forest without the garden has no human presence, has no beings to appreciate it, to defend it against the specific quality of industrial exploitation that threatens both forest and garden alike. The garden without the forest has no watershed, has no deep root structure to stabilize the water table, to prevent erosion, to maintain the specific quality of hydrological stability that productive agriculture requires. The Ents without the Entwives are an ecosystem in imbalance. The forest is present. The garden is absent. The wild is maintained. The tame is destroyed. The balance, the specific, ecological, mutually sustaining balance between the forest and the garden is broken. The imbalance is the Entwives' absence made ecological. The grief that Treebeard feels is not merely personal, not merely the individual being's grief for the lost beloved. The grief is ecological. The grief is the forest's grief for the garden that should be beside it and that is gone. Part 43. The Unanswered Letter. In 1954, a young reader wrote to Tolkien asking about the Entwives. The reader wanted to know, are the Entwives alive? Where are they? Will the Ents find them? Tolkien's response, letter 144, the letter we have discussed, is the response of an author who cares deeply about the question and who refuses to answer it completely. Tolkien says the Entwives were destroyed with their gardens. Then he says he does not know for certain. Then he suggests that the Entwives might have survived. Then he stops. The letter is an unanswered letter. The letter asks a question and provides several possible answers and confirms none of them. The letter is the narrative in miniature, the question, the possibilities, the refusal to resolve, but the letter reveals something that the narrative does not. Tolkien's emotional investment in the question. The letter is not casual. The letter is not dismissive. The letter takes the question, seriously engages with it, considers it, turns it over with the specific quality of careful, attentive thought that Tolkien brings to the elements of his mythology that matter most to him. The Entwives matter to Tolkien. The question matters. The absence matters. And the mattering is expressed in the letter's careful, non-committal, deliberately ambiguous response, a response that says, I care about this question too much to answer it poorly, and I care about this question too much to answer it at all. Part 44. The Waiting. Part 43b. What the war cost the War of the Ring cost the Ents. Not in the way it cost the mortal peoples, not in soldiers killed, not in territories lost, not in the specific quality of military casualty that the war's human participants experienced. The war cost the Ents something different. Something that the Ents could not afford to lose. The war cost the Ents time. Time is not the same thing for the Ents as it is for mortals. For mortals, time is scarce. For the Ents, time is the medium of existence. The Ents have time the way fish have water. But time, for the Ents, has a direction. Time flows toward the becoming tree-ish. Every year that passes is a year in which the Ents are slightly more tree-ish than they were the year before. Every century is a century of slow, incremental, irreversible decline. The War of the Ring consumed the Ents' attention for months, during which the Ents were not searching for the Entwives, not tending the forest with the specific quality of ancient patience that the tending requires, not doing the quiet, slow, deep work that sustains the Ents' animation against the becoming tree-ish. The Entmoot. The march on Isengard. The siege. The flooding. The months of maintaining the guard over the flooded fortress. All of this was time that the Ents spent on the war rather than on the search, time that the Ents spent fighting rather than looking, time that the war consumed and that the Ents could not recover. The war was necessary. The war was justified. The Ents' assault on Isengard was the correct action, was the action that the threat to the forest demanded, was the action that the Ents' custodial purpose required. But the war was also a cost. The war consumed time that the Ents could have spent searching. The war consumed energy that the Ents could have spent maintaining their animation. The war consumed the specific quality of slow, patient, attentive existence that sustains the Ents against the fading. The Ents who marched on Isengard were older after the march than they had been before it, not merely in years in tree-ishness. The expenditure of energy, the acceleration of activity, the specific quality of fast, decisive, combat-oriented action that the march required, all of this was anti-Entish. All of this was the opposite of the slow, patient, rooted quality of existence that the Ents' nature demands. The march was necessary. The march was also damaging. The war saved the forest. The war may have accelerated the Ents fading. The cost of protecting the forest was paid in the currency of the protector's own vitality. The guardians defended their charge and spent their lives in the defending. The cruelest dimension of the cost is this. The war that the Ents fought was necessitated, in part, by the absence of the Entwives. If the Entwives had been present, if the complementary system had been intact, if the guardians and the gardeners had been working together, the Ents would have had more resources, more vitality, more of the specific quality of animated existence that the war consumed. The Ents fought the war depleted, fought the war as half-beings, as guardians without garden, as a complementary system operating on one half of its capacity. The Ents won the battle at Isengard. The Ents may have lost the war against the fading. The victory saved the forest. The cost may have been the last reserve of vitality that stood between the Ents and the complete becoming tree-ish. Part 43c. The question nobody asks. There is a question about the Entwives that nobody in the mythology asks, and the unasked question is the most telling absence in the entire narrative. Nobody asks the Entwives what they want. Treebeard asks, where are the Entwives? The question is about location. Merry and Pippin listen to the question and feel the grief. The hobbits' response is emotional. They pity Treebeard. They sympathize with the loss. They feel the sadness that the old Ents song produces. But nobody asks, what do the Entwives want? Do the Entwives want to be found? Do the Entwives want to return to the forest? Do the Entwives want the reunion that the Ents have been searching for? The question is never asked because the narrative assumes that the answer is obvious. Of course the Entwives want to be found. Of course the Entwives want reunion. Of course the separated beings want to be together again. But the assumption is the assumption of the seeker, not the sought. The Ents want to find the Entwives. The Ents assume that the Entwives want to be found, but the Entwives' desires, the Entwives' actual, specific, voiced preferences are unknown. The Entwives have not been asked. The unasked question is the deepest dimension of the Ents' failure to understand the Entwives. The Ents search for the Entwives without knowing whether the Entwives want to be searched for. The Ents assume the Entwives' desires based on the Ents' own desires. The Ents project their own longing onto the Entwives and assume that the longing is mutual. The longing may be mutual. The Entwives may want the reunion as desperately as the Ents do. But we do not know because nobody has asked the Entwives. And the not asking is the final expression of the perceptual gap that defines the Ents' relationship with the Entwives. The Ents cannot see the Entwives' world, cannot hear the Entwives' voice, cannot ask the Entwives' question. The Ents search. The Entwives are silent, and the silence, the permanent, unbridgeable, narrative-spanning silence of the beings whose perspective is never represented, is the Entwives' story at its most essential. A story about beings who are defined entirely by other beings' grief for their absence, and whose own perspective on the absence is the thing the story never provides. Part 44. The Waiting. The Ents wait. This is what the Ents do. Not just in the context of the Entwives, in the context of everything. The Ents' fundamental mode of existence is waiting. The Ents wait for the trees to grow. The Ents wait for the seasons to turn. The Ents wait with the specific quality of ancient, geological, tree-scale patience that makes mortal urgency look frantic and mortal grief look brief. The Ents wait for the Entwives. The waiting is the same quality of waiting that the Ents bring to everything patient, deep, unhurried, root level. The waiting is not passive. The waiting is the Ents mode of engagement with a problem that cannot be solved by action. The Ents have searched. The search has failed. What remains is the waiting, the specific. Patient, hope-sustained quality of remaining available for the reunion that may never come. The waiting is not despair. The waiting is the opposite of despair. Despair says, the lost thing will never be found. The waiting says, I do not know whether the lost thing will be found, but I will be here, available, ready, if the finding happens. The distinction between despair and waiting is the distinction that sustains the Ents. The Ents do not despair. The Ents wait. The waiting is sustained by the hope the fragile, evidence-free, rationally unjustifiable hope that the Entwives may yet return. The hope may be futile. The waiting may be pointless. The Entwives may be dead, may be gone, may be irrevocably absent from the world. The hope may be the cruelest dimension of the immortal grief, the thing that keeps the wound open, that prevents the healing that finality would provide. But the hope is also the thing that keeps the Ents alive. The hope is the vitality. The hope is the animation that sustains the Ents against the becoming tree-ish that threatens to consume. Remove the hope, and the Ents become trees. The hope futile, evidence-free, rationally unjustifiable is the thing that keeps the Ents from fading entirely. The hope is the Entwives' last gift, the gift of the possibility that the story is not over, the gift of the maybe that keeps the wound open and the being alive. Part 45. The deepest question. The deepest question in the Entwives story is not where are the Entwives. The deepest question is, can two beings who love different things share a world? The question extends beyond the Ents and the Entwives. The question applies to every relationship, every partnership, every friendship, every alliance between beings whose natures drive them toward different. Can the forest and the garden coexist? Can the wild and the tame share a landscape? Can the guardian and the gardener find a way to tend the same earth without requiring the earth to be exclusively wild or exclusively tame? The mythology suggests, maybe. The specific, tentative, never confirmed, never denied maybe that runs through the Entwives story, the maybe of the show, the maybe of the old forest, the maybe of Sam's garden, suggests that coexistence is possible, that the forest and the garden can share a world, that the guardian and the gardener can find a way. But the coexistence requires something that the Ents and the Entwives did not achieve, the willingness to see through the other's eyes, the willingness to visit the other's landscape, the willingness to perceive the garden as a valid expression of love for growing things, and the forest as a valid expression of love for growing things, and both as dimensions of the same fundamental impulse. The Ents and the Entwives failed because neither could see through the other's eyes. The Ents saw the world through the forest's eyes and could not see the garden. The Entwives saw the world through the garden's eyes and could not see the forest. The failure was mutual, was symmetrical, was the product of the same quality of loyalty to one's nature that makes both the Ents and the Entwives admirable and that makes both the Ents and the Entwives tragic. The deepest question remains the question of whether the forest and the garden can coexist. The question of whether two kinds of love can share a world is the question that the mythology poses and does not resolve. The question persists. The question outlasts the specific narrative. The question is the Entwives' final legacy, not an answer but a question that every generation must face and that no generation has definitively answered. Part 46. What we do not know. Let me list what we do not know about the Entwives, because the list is itself a statement about the nature of loss. We do not know the Entwives' names. We know Treebeard's name Fangorn in Elvish. We know the names of other Ents Quickbeam, Leaflock, Skinbark. We do not know a single Entwife's name. The beings who taught men agriculture, who created the foundation of mortal civilization, who built the gardens that fed the peoples of the East, those beings are nameless. Their names are lost. Their individual identities are subsumed under the collective noun, the Entwives. And the collective noun carries no specific personal, "this is who she was" quality. We do not know what the Entwives looked like. We know what the Ents look like. Treebeard is described in detail, with his bark like skin and his green shot eyes and his slow, deliberate movements. The Entwives are not described. The Entwives' appearance is unknown, is present only in the general statement that the Entwives were more interested in smaller plants than in great trees, suggesting a different form, a different scale, a different specific quality of physical being than the Ents display. We do not know what the Entwives thought about the separation. We know what Treebeard thinks. Treebeard tells us, sings about it, grieves in front of the hobbits. We do not know what the Entwives thought. Did they miss the Ents? Did they regret the separation? Did they try to return? Did they accept the separation as necessary, as inevitable, as the natural consequence of two natures that cannot share a landscape? We do not know. The Entwives' inner life is hidden. The Entwives' perspective is absent. The Entwives' voice is silent. The list of unknowns is the list of what loss means. Loss is not simply the absence of the thing. Loss is the absence of the thing's name, the thing's appearance, the thing's voice, the thing's inner life. Loss is the absence of everything that makes the thing a specific, individual, irreplaceable being rather than a category. The Entwives are a category, not individuals, not named beings with described appearances and voiced perspectives. A category. The Entwives. The collective noun that contains no individual nouns. The group that has no members. Part 47. The hope. After everything, after the separation, the destruction, the search, the silence, the fading, the extinction, after all of it, there is hope. The hope is small. The hope is quiet. The hope is the specific quality of not giving up that persists in the face of every reason to give up. The hope is Treebeard's song, sung alone, in the forest, to an audience that may or may not exist. The hope is Sam's garden, tended with care, in the soil that may or may not bear the Entwives' mark. The hope is the mullein tree in the Shire, growing in the party field, golden and impossible, sustained by a quality of soil that should not exist in that climate and that latitude. The hope is the walking tree that Hal saw in the North Farthing, the tree-like figure, taller than an elm, striding through the Shire with a purpose that Hal could not identify and that the narrative does not explain. The hope is Treebeard's promise. Together we will take the road that leads into the west, and far away we'll find a land where both our hearts may rest. The land may not exist. The road may not lead there. The promise may be the empty hope of a being who has been hoping for too long. But the promise is still made. The song is still sung. The search, though it has found nothing, has not stopped. The Ents, though they are fading, have not faded entirely. The question, though it has no answer, has not stopped being asked. The hope is not evidence. The hope is not certainty. The hope is the specific quality of refusal, the refusal to accept the loss as final, the refusal to stop searching, the refusal to let the grief become despair. The hope is the Entwives' last trace. Not a physical trace, not a footprint, not a garden, not a song. A spiritual trace. The trace of the possibility that the story is not over. The trace of the maybe that keeps the question alive. Part 48. The final image. Here is the image I want to leave you with. Fangorn Forest. Deep in the trees. The specific quality of green light that filters through the canopy of the ancient forest, the light that has been filtering through these branches for thousands of years. Treebeard is standing. Still, the way Ents stand rooted, patient. The specific quality of standing that is indistinguishable from the standing of the trees, except for the eyes. The eyes are open. The eyes are looking east. The east is where the Entwives went. The east is where the gardens were. The east is where the brown lands stretch, barren and dead, under the sky that once covered the most beautiful cultivated landscape in Middle-earth. Treebeard is looking east. Not searching the searching is over, has been over for centuries. Looking, with the specific quality of looking that is not observation, but remembrance. The looking of a being who knows what used to be there, and who looks at the absence the way a human looks at an empty chair. The forest is quiet. The trees are growing. The specific, slow, deep quality of forest silence the silence that is not absence of sound, but presence of patience, fills the space around the Ent who is looking east. And somewhere, maybe in the Shire, maybe in the old forest, maybe in a landscape that nobody has named, and that the Ents have never searched, somewhere in the world that Tolkien imagined, and that we inhabit through the imagining somewhere, the Entwives are. Or are not. We do not know. We will never know. The question is the story. The not knowing is the grief. The grief is the gift. The gift of caring about beings we have never met, in a world we have never visited, for a reason we cannot entirely explain. The Entwives are gone. The Entwives are the saddest unanswered mystery in Tolkien's mythology. And the sadness, the quiet, persistent, never-resolved sadness, is the quality that makes the story immortal. We are all Treebeard. We are all looking east. We are all singing the song that nobody sings back. And the singing continues. The singing never stops, because the love never stops. And the love, which could not bridge the gap between the forest and the garden, persists in the singing, persists across the millennia, across the ages, across the specific, unbridgeable distance between the beings we love and the places where they went. The Entwives are gone. The song remains. And if you walk through a garden, any garden, and you listen with the specific quality of attention that the Entwives brought to every growing thing they tended, you might hear something. Not a voice, not a word, something quieter than that. Something older. The specific quality of sound that a well-tended garden makes when the wind moves through the leaves and the fruit hangs heavy on the branch and the soil, the ancient, cultivated, impossibly fertile soil hums with a specific quality of vitality that comes from being loved. The Entwives may be in that sound. Or the Entwives' legacy may be in that sound. Or the sound may be nothing more than the wind in the leaves and the fruit on the branch and the soil doing what soil does. We do not know. The question persists. The sound persists. The garden persists. And the persistence, the specific, stubborn, never-extinguished quality of things that continue when the beings who created them are gone, the persistence is the Entwives' most lasting gift. They gardened. The garden remains. The gardeners are gone. And the garden, which cannot remember the gardeners because gardens do not remember, carries the gardener's mark in every leaf and every root and every grain of the extraordinary soil that the gardener's hands once shaped. The Entwives are gone. The garden remembers. Stay with us. The roots go deeper than the forest, and we are not done listening yet.